Hello, friends. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm your host, Zen Garcia.
And this is something that going into these conversations, when I reached out to Zen and invited him to do this with me, he knew that I didn't agree with this theory, and so I was going to. Part two is tonight for me to lay out my rebuttals to some of the things that I heard last time. So hopefully it'll be an engaging show tonight, and hopefully it'll edify folks so they can dig into the scriptures and test it for themselves. And as always, guys, if you learn anything from these shows, please make sure to share them. That's how we get around the algorithms. And as always, with the Milk and Meat live streams, all of the slides that you see me present that I've taken the time to prepare throughout the week, I'm going to put those up and they're available on Patreon. So if you guys haven't already visited us on Patreon, go do that and you can access and download all the slides from our Milk and Meat live streams. All right, guys. So let me see here. Let me say hello to a couple people in the chat. Thank you, David Cheery. Says everything's looked good and sounds good. Jason RN is here. Kingdom Truther. Arc Builders CCMC, welcome. Miss Marsha, welcome. And we've got a few people already here in the chat. All right, so I'm going to bring on Mr. Zen Garcia. Hello, brother. Welcome to Milk and Meat live stream again.
Glad to be here with you and your listening audience. I appreciate the invitation and looking forward to the discourse.
Yeah, outstanding. So last time, I think you may have heard some of the intro, but last time we had pretty much, I just wanted to kind of give you the floor. I didn't really want to interrupt you too much. I just want to make sure that you could, fully present your case. Because like I had talked to you about before we even did this, was there's so much different ideas about what this serpent seed theory is that I've heard going around throughout the years. And I thought, if anybody, you're probably the best person to lay out the case for it. And from what I've seen from you, the way you see it and the way you view it doesn't go too far off into the fringes. You know what I mean? Like you do find things in the scripture that you feel lead to this conclusion. I've seen other people kind of take some really wild tangents with this idea, and like they do with all types of teachings and doctrines. So that's why I was wanting to make sure that you were able to lay out everything that you wanted to say. And tonight, if there's additional stuff that you want to talk about, we can definitely do that. So I had prepared a couple of rebuttals to the things you mentioned last week. And then after that, you're welcome to counter rebuttal, or we can just do open discussion either way. And then for the listening audience, after Zen and I kind of finish with our first portion of this broadcast, we're going to take some questions from you. So if you're in the chat, as always, hold your questions until the very end so that we can see them, because they'll get lost in the live chat if you try to ask them now. So hold your questions to the end and put your caps lock on, then type out your question, turn your caps lock off. That way our moderators and myself, we can easily see your questions so that you have a better chance of getting them asked. So, all right. Well, Zen, are you ready?
I am, brother.
Okay, brother. I'm gonna screen share for a minute and go over some of my slides. All right. If I can pull it up. There we go. Okay, brother. So I prepared, just you made a lot of points last time we were together on part one. And I didn't want to address all of them because some of them I felt lended to supplemental teachings that lended to. So I thought, let me just try to address, if possible, the most direct things pertaining directly to the serpent seed theory. And that's what I wanted to present tonight. So the first claim that I heard from you last time we were here was the Jerusalem Targum, which is, the scholars also call it the pseudo-Jonathan Targum, right? This being sometimes also called just the Aramaic Targum, because the word Targum is an Aramaic word. And so this was something that's been passed over through history, it wasn't put into a kind of a canonization process, but it was an actual translation, like we talked about, right? The word Targum just means translation.
Right.
And so this was a Jerusalem Targum is kind of the one that's most well known, if you will. And it's kind of from what I could understand, it's a little, you were saying that it was the oldest and the most authoritative. You think that this was the Targum that they brought from the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then it kind of carried forward throughout the years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's where I was looking into the history and legitimacy of this Targum to see what was, what I could find that scholars said about it, and we're going to look at some of the text as well. So from the basic Britannica, the Encyclopedia Britannica, I found that there's a biblical translation is called a Targum in Aramaic, but it's a biblical translation as a general concept for the viewer, because a lot of people get kind of confused with the terminology. This is an art and practice of rendering a Bible into languages other than those it was originally written. Both Old and New Testaments have long histories of translations. We are aware of this. The reason I'm presenting this for the audience is so they know the difference between a Bible translation and an actual word-for-word translation. So sometimes people get kind of tripped up in thinking that any translation is word for word instead of being an interpretive translation like we see. And a lot of people don't realize this. When you go to like Bible Gateway or you go to like Bible Hub and you can cross-reference a whole bunch of Bible translations all at once, the reason why we have so many Bible translations is because copyright laws do not allow these publishers to, basically commit plagiarism. So if the translation that they're wanting to print and publish and sell for profit is too close to a previous translation, then they'll be, sued for copyright infringement or plagiarism. And so they have to come out with a different take. They rearrange some words, they pull out the thesaurus, and they put some different words in there. They most of them stick true to the meaning, but they just rearrange the sentence structure, put some different words in there, and try to make it seem different so they can get it published. Because the Bible sells 100 million copies a year. It's one of the most highest selling books in the world. In fact, I found out a few years ago, they don't even put the Bible on the New York Times bestseller list for books because it outsells every other book out there so greatly that it dwarfs all the other books. They don't even put it on that list anymore. It is the number one selling book in the world. So that's, as a result of that, people see an opportunity to make a new translation. But there is a difference between an actual translation of the Bible and a word for word. So like I have on the screen here, English, means man. In Spanish, it means hombre. And in Hebrew, it's ish, right? So this is a word for word translation between languages. The Bible is not this direct. Not always. There are some, what they call literal translations out there, but some of the Targums, i.e. translations, are not that direct. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. Genesis 1:1-2 in the Masoretic translation. It's, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Earth was without form and void. Darkness was upon the face of the deep. The Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And then if you look at the Onkelos Aramaic translation of the same passage, it says, at the beginning, the Lord created the heavens and the earth. The earth was vacancy and desolation, solitary of the sons of men, void of every animal, and darkness was upon the face of the abyss. The spirit of mercies from before the Lord breathed upon the face of the waters. So we can see that there is a little bit more going on here. Now, supposedly, the Onkelos Aramaic translation was from the 2nd century CE, or AD. Some people understand AD. And the Masoretic, the Rabbinic Masoretic translation was approximately the 8th or 9th century CE. So the Onkelos is supposedly about 700 years before the traditional Masoretic that we all have for our modern English translations today. But then if we compare the Septuagint of the same passage, the first two verses of Genesis 1, it says, in the beginning, God made the heaven and the earth, but the earth was unsightly and unfurnished, and darkness was over the deep. The Spirit of God moved over the water. So we have here, if you're following along, three very different descriptions. It is speaking about the same thing, but there's different words used as adjectives. There's different sentence structures. There's the most words as far as total words used in these two sentences. The Onkelos Aramaic translation, wins that battle. It has the most. So we start to ask ourselves, we know that supposedly the Septuagint is the oldest, being the 3rd century BCE. There were multiple Septuagints commissioned by the rabbis in the 1st century. So therefore, even within that, there's variations that we see throughout history. But it's very much brief and to the point. But the translation of one of these Aramaic Targums that was used in Jerusalem in the 1st and 2nd century, it has a little bit more wording than some of these other translations. So this one is approved by rabbis. This was literally the Rabbinic Masoretic translation. Okay, so they came together in 8th, 9th century, and many of you guys remember our Milk and Meat live stream that we did a few weeks ago, where I go through history and I show all the places in the scriptures that the rabbis were literally tinkering with the scriptures to hide Yeshua, and they took out, changed, and altered many scriptures. And so as a result of that, they come up with their own translation. This is the Masoretic translation that we all know. This is the one from which most of our English Bibles are derived today. Also, the Onkelos translation was a part of their rabbinic community. It was a part of their earlier versions of Scripture, because the majority of people in the 1st and 2nd century AD, they were using a version of the Septuagint. And this was widely known throughout the history of the Septuagint, that the rabbis did not like the Septuagint translation, which is why they started tinkering with it, try to make their own Greek translations so they could take out some of the stuff about Christ and hide Christ as much as possible. We did a whole show on that, guys. So go check that out. It was 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's proof that the Pharisees tried to hide Yeshua in Scripture. The Hebrew Union College and Jewish Institute of Religion, this was their take on these ideas of these targums, both the Onkelos, the Pseudo-Jonathan, and also the Jerusalem Targum, which apparently I found out there's three different Jerusalem Targums. Apparently number 2 and number 3 are fragmented heavily. So number 1 is pretty much the same, but I'll just read some of this here. It says, composed in the 2nd century, as far as the Onkelos Targum, which is specifically on the Torah or the Pentateuch, supposedly composed in the 2nd century and in the land of Israel, but it was extradited and studied primarily in Babylon. So that's interesting, because it was, moved around according to the religious leaders of the day. It's generally quite literal in its translation, but it's expansive in the poetic sections. Then the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, known as the Targum Jonathan in Rabbinic Bibles, but referred to as the Jerusalem 1 Targum in the Jasper's Dictionary of Rabbinic Hebrew and Aramaic, that was derived around the 8th century and CE, and its composition incorporated earlier Midrash and Targum material. So for many of you guys that are not aware, Midrash is commentary from the rabbis. We see a lot of Midrash in the Talmud. So this is one of those, right here, it's telling you that this particular Targum has some insertions in it that weren't originally there. So the Targum Jerusalem is used in land of Israel in the West, also built on the basis of the Onkelos, but adding extensive Midrash with exposition, was finalized in the Byzantine era. And then prior to the 1950s, it was known only from the fragments preserved in what's called the fragment Targums and fragmentary pages of the Cairo. So the prophets, and the reason why I included this down here from their commentary and their study of these Targums, is it says in the Targum Jonathan, roughly contemporary with the Targum Onkelos, but with extensive interpretive material. And this is not on the Torah, this is not Genesis through Deuteronomy, but these are on the books of the prophets. And it says these texts are especially noteworthy as representatives of rabbinic theology. And that's exactly what we'd be reading in the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, where it says it's incorporating earlier Midrash. That's what that means. It's their interpretations of their theology and their ideas, just like we were showing a few weeks ago, of how the rabbinic leaders, Jewish leaders of that day, were removing scriptures. In this case, they're adding in what is called didactic teachings, which is basically means they're trying to insert moral teachings into places in the text to help the reader get a grasp of what the rabbis think that it's saying. So that's it's called an admixture. And I'll just read here what the Britannica talks about as far as the Pseudo-Jonathan Targum. It says there are several Targums, translations of the Pentateuch. The Babylonian Targum is known as Onkelos, named after its reputed author. The Targum is Palestinian in origin, but it's early transferred to Babylon, where it was revised. So that means we do not have the original version of the Onkelos Targum, and it received great authority. At a later date, probably not before the 9th century CE, it was re-exported back to Palestine, that's in the land of Judea, where it displaced other local Targums. And on the whole, Onkelos is quite literal, but it shows a tendency to obscure expressions attributing human form and feelings to God. It's usually it faithfully reflects rabbinic exegesis. If the Jerusalem Targum, the Jerusalem Targum is a composite of the Old Palestinian Targum and an early version of the Onkelos with an admixture of material from diverse periods. It contains much rabbinic material as well as homiletic, which is an art of speaking, the way it's written, meaning that the whole concept of saying that it is homiletic means that the sentence structure is being messed with and it's not the original. And didactic amplifications, these are insertions, like I said, to intend to teach moral ideas. There's evidence of great antiquity, but also much later material indicating Pseudo-Jonathan could not have received its present form before the Islamic period. Here in Jubilees 2:2, here's an example of rabbinic midrash and exposition that we can compare with something that is not accepted by rabbis, compared to the pseudo-Jonathan Targum that is accepted by rabbis. So here in Jubilees 2:2, where it says, "For on the first day he created the heavens which are above, and the earth and the waters, and all the spirits which serve before him." And then down below in the Jerusalem Targum, it says, "The Lord said to the angels who ministered before him, who had been created in the second day of the creation of the world." So we have a discrepancy between when the angels are created with Jubilees and the Jerusalem Targum. So is this potentially one of the places they inserted their own ideas, their own midrash? I would suggest it is. The Jubilees text is dated back in the BC, before these Targums were compiled and revised. And it's no wonder that the Jubilees Targum is rejected. The Jerusalem Targum is approved by the very people who compiled it. The second claim was the Book of Adam and Eve claims Adam and Eve had light vestures and not skin when they were removed. So what I looked into the book of First of Adam and Eve, I mean, we've studied it before. We considered doing on Honor of Kings season 3. We considered doing, several episodes on this. We just hadn't had a chance to get around to it yet. But in chapter 13, verse 6 and 7, I think, Zen, this is where you were getting this idea. And it does, I think in chapter 52, it does mention it again. There's some different ideas where it talks about further. But it says in verse 6, on thee, O Adam, while in my garden and obedient to me, did that bright light rest also. But when I heard of your transgression, I deprived you of that bright light. Yet of my mercy, I did not turn you into darkness, but I made you your body of flesh, over which I spread this skin, in order that it may bear cold and heat. All right, so this is where I would have a disagreement with what the first book of Adam and Eve teaches, being that Genesis, from my understanding, tells us Adam and Eve were given flesh from the get-go, from the very beginning, before they were even put in the yard, when they were raised from the dust. As Genesis 2:7 says, that God formed man from the dust. And then in verse 23, when Adam is now looking at Eve, who was made from his rib, he turns to her and says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." So therefore, I would feel like that's a discrepancy. Same thing with Jubilees chapter 3. It would be a discrepancy with the first book of Adam and Eve's claim, because it says in chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, that he built up the flesh in its stead where he pulled the rib from Adam to make Eve. And in turn, he says the same thing, that she's bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. Jubilees also goes on to explain that Adam and Eve were not made on the same day. In fact, Adam was made on day 6 of week 1, and Eve was made on day 6 of week 2. And that would be a discrepancy of what book of Adam and Eve said they're made on the same day together, I think. So Jubilees chapter 3, verse 8 through 9 goes on to say, and after Adam had completed 40 days in the land where he'd been created, we brought him into the Garden of Eden to till it, to keep it. But his wife they brought in on the 80th day. After this, she entered into the garden. And then the next following verses, 10, 11, and 12, go on to explain why they waited to bring Adam and Eve into the garden. And it was literally because of Leviticus 12, the law of those going through a purification process. And Adam had to wait 40 days. The female Eve had to wait 80 days. And that's why they were not created on the same day, and they were not brought into the garden in bodies of light. They had real bones and real flesh from the start to be brought in there, as I can see from Genesis and Jubilees. Also in 1 Corinthians 15, 45 through 47, it says, "So it's also written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, then the spiritual. The first man is from the earth, earthy. The second man is from heaven." That's going off this premise of it, that I feel attaches to Genesis 2 and Jubilees 3, that Adam was formed from the dust of the earth. He was not in some sort of light body, and he did not have skin formed for him after he transgressed. He had skin from the very beginning. So claim number 3, Cain and Abel were twins. Cain was Satan's child. Abel was Adam's child. Eve was impregnated by both Satan and Adam on the same day. So just for the viewer, I'm going to try to say that one more time. So this was part of the claim of the serpent seed theory, was that Cain and Abel were twins, and that Cain was as a result of Satan mixing with Eve, and then Abel was a result of Adam mixing with Eve, and though she was pregnant with 2 different seeds on the same day. And we're going to look at that real quick. So the claims of all the books that I could find that actually talk about Cain and Abel being born, only the Jerusalem Targum is the one that claims that Cain and Abel were twins. In the Masoretic Genesis, it doesn't say it. In the Septuagint Genesis, it doesn't say it. In Jubilees, it definitely doesn't say it. And I'm going to go into that in a few more minutes in my last point. The first book of Adam and Eve itself doesn't say it. So in the first book of Adam and Eve, it actually says that Cain had a sister as his twin when they were born, and then Abel had a sister later when he was birthed. So there were two sets of twins. Cain and a sister were one set, Abel and another sister were another set, and they were born at different time periods. And then Jasher also does not talk about them being twins either, with Cain and Abel being birthed. The fourth claim, that Adam was 60 cubits tall, and this lended into a couple of different ideas, but I just wanted to hit this one kind of quickly because there's a couple of large issues with this kind of concept. Now, I don't doubt that mankind could have been taller, right? We know that it's possible with the Nephilim for human flesh to grow tall and be big with giants. But was Adam actually of that stature? I know the Apocalypse of Abraham talks about them being of great stature, but specifically 60 cubits tall. From what I heard in the presentation last time, you said that this came from the Quran, and so this is
Gospel of Bartholomew.
Yeah, I couldn't find it in the Gospel of Bartholomew. Maybe you can send me the text afterwards. I just could not find. I read through several versions. I could not see it. So I did find this information in the Quran, in the Hadith, and so that's, of course. Most of the viewers would not take the Quran as a validated source, especially because Allah is considered a different God. Yahweh created Adam. Muhammad's not a prophet of Yahweh. Islam rejects Yeshua as the son of God and the Messiah. So that source I wouldn't take. But you did mention the Quran last time. So I think you mentioned it right after the Gospel of Bartholomew, which is why I searched both. But basically, what I see here in Genesis 6, 14, and 15, it gives us the dimensions of Noah's Ark. And it says the length of the ark was 300 cubits. And from what and correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that you were making the argument that Adam was of this stature and they all were until Noah. And then after Noah, that's when they started decreasing in size and lifespan. And so if that was the case, the length of the ark would not facilitate men of that size. It's only 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits broad, and 30 cubits in height, which here's a visual representation of what that would look like. We would have some issues with them actually getting in the boat if mankind was anywhere near that size, as well as the food that they would need to take with them and the sustenance and the other animals. The fifth claim, the serpent had sex with Eve. So this is pretty much the crux of the claim. And I looked into 1 Enoch chapter 10, and the reason why I'm bringing this up for the viewer is because I don't see in any of the texts, and I'm going to go over this in just a minute, I don't see personally the wording that supports it. And I'm going to go over the actual wording of Genesis 4:1 as you did earlier or a few weeks ago in my subsequent points here. But the reason why I'm showing this subtitle up here that says the punishment doesn't fit the crime is because the other angels that we see in the rebellious watchers in the book of Enoch who actually took wives and had children by them, they receive a specific punishment for doing that, directly related to doing that. And Azazel, whom you and I both agree is the one that was there in the garden with Adam and Eve, seducing them, which I don't think is a literal sexual seduce. I think it's a beguiling. It's a trickery seduce, as the word can be used for. And it says that he got a different punishment. And we see that both of their punishments are not enacted until, years after they're actually sentenced, right? So after the proclamation of their punishment is spoken by the Lord and communicated through the angels, through Enoch to the watchers, that their punishment doesn't happen that day. So it's communicated that Azazel, here in I think it's verse 8 and 9, that the Lord said to Raphael, bind Azazel hand and foot, cast him into the darkness, make an opening in the desert which is in to dwell, and cast him there, place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever. Now I also put in parentheses, and that is my insertion. I just want everyone to know this. The word forever in the book of Enoch is in a loose English translation of the Hebrew word and also the Paleo-Hebrew word olam, which is an idea for a long span of time and age a long duration, and it also can mean eternity. You have to look at the context to know how that's being used. Just like a lot of Hebrew words, you got to look at the context. And so they're told to put him in there, let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light. And then on the great day of judgment, he shall be cast into the fire. Now, we don't actually see that come true until Revelation 20. He's put in the hole in the ground for 1,000 years, and then he's pulled out, thrown in the lake of fire. In the meantime, he's running around everywhere. But the other angels that were with him, specifically in verse 11, the Lord said unto Michael, go to Samyaza and his associates, and who have united themselves with women, so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. So we have Azazel being differentiated from the other rebellious watchers. They're all rebellious. They all taught mankind things they shouldn't have, but specifically this sin of taking a woman and having a wife out of her and impregnating her and causing a child. The punishment is not given to Azazel for that. He's given a totally different punishment. It doesn't say that he did this. It just separates unto these other watchers and explains that they did it, and that they are going to be. Here's the punishment that they get is, he goes on to say in 15, 1-7, he answered and said to me, and I heard his voice, fear not, Enoch, you righteous man and scribe of righteousness, approach here and hear my voice. Go say to the watchers of heaven who have sent you to intercede for them, you should intercede for men and not men for you. Wherefore have you left the high, holy, and eternal heaven and lain with women and defiled yourselves with daughters of men and taken to yourselves wives and done like the children of earth and begotten giants as your sons? So again, it's just kind of expounding on the actual crime that these particular angels did. And then we see that reverberated in Jude 1:6, the angels who did not keep their own domain, abandon their proper abode. He has kept them in eternal bonds under darkness for the great day of judgment. The punishment is spelled out, which angels did that punishment, and then what type of judgment they're beginning, what type of punishment. And that lines up with 1 Enoch 18, where he goes on in verses 11-6 and also 19:1. He says, I saw a deep abyss with the columns of fire, and among them I saw columns of fire fall, which were beyond measure alike toward the heavens and toward the depth. And beyond that abyss I saw a place which had no firmament of the heaven above, and no firmly founded earth beneath it. There was no water upon it and no birds, but it was waste and horrible place. I saw there 7 stars like great burning mountains. And to me, when I inquired regarding them, the angel said, this place is the end of heaven and earth. And this has become a prison for the stars and the host of heaven. And the stars which roll over the fire are they which have transgressed the commandment of the Lord in the beginning of their rising, because they did not come forth at their appointed times. And he was wroth with them and bound them till the time when their guilt should be consummated, even for 10,000 years. And Uriel said unto me, here shall stand the angels who have connected themselves with women, and their spirits assuming many different forms are defiling mankind, and shall lead them astray into sacrificing to demons as gods. Here shall they stand till the great day of judgment, in which they shall be judged till they're made an end of. And so that lines up with what we read earlier, 8 chapters earlier in Enoch as well. And Azazel not part of that crowd. Here in Job chapter 1:6-7, we actually see that Azazel, who's called Mastema, he's also called Gadriel. He's also, he's has several different names. He's called the Serpent, the Dragon, the Wicked One. He's the Evil One. Job 1:6-7 says, when the Lord asked Satan, where do you come from? Satan answered and said, from roaming about on the earth and walking around on it. So this is where the actual punishment laid out in chapter 10 of Enoch. It separates Azazel and the other angels according to what they did. Their punishments fit their crime. Azazel did not take a wife and did not impregnate anybody. And he's still out running around, as we know, Revelation 12:17, the dragon, right? He goes off to make war with the rest of the children who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. We're dealing with that actively today. He's the same Satan that's tempting Yeshua in Matthew 4 and Luke 4. Also in Revelation 20, this is the moment where his punishment is finally enacted. And this is, then I saw an angel come down from heaven, holding the keys of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and he bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. Claim number 6. Because Cain is not mentioned in the genealogies, he must be Satan's child. That was kind of the argument that I heard from you, right?
That is one of them, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess this one's not very complicated rebuttal. It's simply just Abel's not mentioned either. Neither are any of the other children of Adam and Eve in the genealogies. It just skips right to Seth. So that would be an assumption, in my opinion, because Genesis 5:4 is a place where it mentions that Adam had many other sons and daughters. None of them are named. It's only, we only get kind of the big three, so to speak. Adam, we only get Cain and Abel and Seth. So Cain goes off. We get his whole genealogy. He does his own thing. Abel's killed, and then we get Seth and his genealogy, and we see, him flourish. Also in Jubilees 4:10, it says that Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she bare yet 9 sons. And this is after Cain and Abel are birthed, which I'm going to go over here in just a minute. So I just, to me, that would not be something that would substantiate the theory just because Cain and Abel are not mentioned in the genealogies. Claim number 7, and this is the last one, that Satan fathered Cain through Eve. So not just the simple claim that Satan had sex with Eve, but simply that he fathered Cain through Eve. And this is in Genesis 4:1. This is the Jerusalem Targum, and this is one that I think that you lean on the most to support this theory in this particular verse, where it says, "And Adam knew Hava," that's Eve for the listener. Adam knew Hava, his wife, who had desired the angel, and she conceived, and she bare Cain. And she said, "I've acquired a man, the angel of the Lord." And so I think what you were saying was that because of the insertion of the words, who had desired the angel, and that's where we don't see that in Genesis or Septuagint, in the Masoretic or the Septuagint, or we don't see that in Jubilees. We only see that in this Jerusalem Targum. And that's personally where I would suggest this is the midrash that's been inserted, like I showed from the earlier slides in point number 1. And because the Jerusalem Targum was a mixture of the fragments that they had from the Jerusalem Targum, as well as the Onkelos Targum, and it was compiled and created in the 8th century AD. And that it was also, at that time, they inserted their own midrash and didactic teachings into the texts as you read it. So that's why it's called revised by historians. And that's why we don't see it in the other texts. And it could be why some of the canonization processes didn't include it as a part of the Bible. Because they knew that it was rabbinical midrash that was inserted in there, which is basically interpretive exegesis. Genesis 1:12-13, in the book of Jasher, it says, "Adam knew his wife Eve, and she bore 2 sons and 3 daughters. And she called the name of the firstborn Cain, saying, I've attained a man from the Lord. And the name of the other she called Abel, for she said, in vanity we come into the earth, and in vanity we should be taken from it." And like I said, this is not, there is no mention here of the serpent taking Eve. I don't even agree with Jasher, to be honest with you, brother. I'm using these first 2 I'm using here. I don't think that these are texts that I personally would use to make a case for stuff because of some of the issues with their manuscripts and history. And so that's why I put these 2 up first. But the next ones that I'm presenting, I still honestly don't even agree with the first book of Adam and Eve, but I just wanted to show that when it comes to the actual storyline of did the serpent actually take Eve and make a child with her, in first book of Adam and Eve 54 verse 5 and 6, it says, "And God looked at his maidservant Eve and delivered her, and she brought forth her firstborn son, and with him a daughter. Then Adam rejoiced at Eve's deliverance, and also over the children she had borne him. And Adam ministered unto Eve in the cave until the end of 8 days, when they named the son Cain and the daughter Lelua." So this book directly telling us that Cain and Abel were not born at the same time, and it also has no mention of the serpent taking Eve. It's not the same storyline that you presented. But in the Masoretic and in the Septuagint of Genesis 5:4, excuse me, I'm sorry, this is a typo. This is actually Genesis 4:1. Guys, I'll change this before I upload them to Patreon, but this is Genesis 4:1. It says, the Masoretic says, "Now the man," and the reason why I put this in parentheses, guys, because this is the Hebrew word that they used in the Masoretic for this verse in Genesis 4:1 that says, "Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain." That word in the Hebrew, the man, is not ish, but it's the compilation of wu ha-adam, which is where we get the article the, that's the ha. The word Adam is a word that's also used for man. So that's why it's saying it's not, it doesn't say Adam, and it doesn't say the angel of the Lord. It's literally saying the man had relations with his wife, Eve. This is also a point of context that I think is contradictory with the first book of Adam and Eve, where it claims that they didn't get married until like 7 or 8 months after they were out of the garden. But Jubilees and Genesis suggests that they were already married. Jubilees directly tells you they're already married in chapter 3. I think it's verse 30. So here in the Masoretic in Genesis 4:1, I don't see the actual wording. The text just literally does not say that the serpent took Eve and had sex with her and created a child from her. Also, in the Septuagint version of Genesis 4:1, it said, Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and brought forth Cain, and said, I've gained a man through God. So also missing the idea of the serpent taking her. Jubilees 3:15, 32 through 34, and then also 4 and 1. So this is the latter end of Jubilees 3, as well as the beginning of Jubilees 4. It says, in the first week of the first Jubilee, Adam and his wife were in the Garden of Eden for 7 years, tilling and keeping it. And we gave him work, and we instructed him to do everything that's suitable for tillage. Okay, so that's verse 15. It's telling you a time frame that Adam and Eve were in the garden for 7 years before they were kicked out. And that's where it says in the later verses that on the anniversary of the day they were brought in there, 7 years to the day, that's when the serpent came up and deceived them. Verse 32 through 34 of the same chapter, it says, and on the new moon of the 4th month, Adam and his wife went forth from the Garden of Eden, and they dwelt in the land of Eldah, in the land of their creation. And Adam called the name of his wife Eve. And they had no son till the first Jubilee. And after this, that's 49 years, he knew her. And in the 3rd week, in the 2nd Jubilee, that's 21 years, she gave birth to Cain. And in the 4th, she gave birth to Abel. And in the 5th, she gave birth to her daughter Awan. And that's Jubilees 4:1. So from these texts in Jubilees, it tells us, just for the viewer that's walking, many of the people don't realize what a Jubilee is and why the book of Jubilees is called the book of Jubilees. So how long is a Jubilee of years? It's 49 years. What makes a Jubilee is 7 weeks of years. So basically you're dividing 49 years by 7, and that's how they break it up into 7 increments. And they call each of those increments a week of years. So what's a week of years? That's 7 years. So 7 years times 7 is a Jubilee. So this is where we get 7 weeks of years equals 1 Jubilee. So if we go back to this text in Jubilees chapter 3, in the beginning of chapter 4, it tells us that they, Adam and Eve, had no son till the first Jubilee. So that's 49 years in. And after that, 21 years after that, she conceived Cain and gave birth to Cain. So if we do the math, Adam and Eve were in the garden for 7 years. Adam and Eve were deceived by the serpent at the anniversary of that. And at the beginning of the 8th year, they were removed from the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve did not conceive in the first Jubilee, which is 49 years. And in fact, they didn't even conceive until 21 years into the second Jubilee, which would be year 71 of creation. And technically, that means it would be 63 years after they were expelled from the garden that Cain was conceived and birthed by Eve. And all the texts that I could find directly tell us that Adam knew his wife and she conceived Cain. So that's all I have as far as the basic claims that I heard from you the other night, brother, and why I disagree with them according to the texts. And like I said in the first time we talked last time, there were some books that you were using that I struggled with as far as their validation and whether or not I would use them. So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, that's fine. All right, let's go through all of these points. First, with regard to the Targum, Wikipedia says that it was created in the 2nd century CE, but if you look at when and the reasons for the Targum coming into being, it's my opinion that they predate even the Septuagint, and that it goes back to the after the diaspora of Nebuchadnezzar's day and the Holy Temple being built, and it was when worship was reinstituted that this translation came into being and came to be used. And it was used by the Israelites once they returned from the diaspora because they assimilated Aramaic as their predominant lexicon. And so Hebrew was no longer used. And so, and you
Right.
can find,
That's what I had to.
well, I'm
Right.
just saying you can
Yeah, I
find,
was going to say that's why we also see in the early.
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just saying that's why we see the Greek Septuagint also arise on the.
Well, before the Greek was the Aramaic, and that's why you see
Agree.
in the books of
Yeah.
Daniel and Jeremiah, portions of it dating back to when they were in Babylon. That's when the Aramaic began to be used. And so it dates back way further than the second century CE. And so all those professionals, or the scholars out there that date it to this time, that in my opinion, they're wrong. And you can look at even Daniel and Jeremiah and other portions when they were in Babylon. That's when they began to use the Aramaic. And the reason why the Targum came into being was to um, so that they could use a text because they were speaking Aramaic. And when they
Mhm.
rebuilt the temple in the 4th century BC, that's when they needed it, and that's when they used it, and that's when the translation was authorized. And so, in my opinion, it precedes the Septuagint, which dates back to the 2nd century BC. And so it's like 200 years older. And you're saying that, there's all these additions and um, things that were added. But in my opinion, these things were part of the original translations, and we see that things were removed. Even as you said, that they were trying to hide Christ from the Septuagint. Well, this is the same thing for the Targum as well. My son released a book called The Word of the Lord, a comparative analysis of the hidden Memra that shows 217 times in the first 5 books of the Pentateuch that the translations for the word of the Lord and allusion to Christ and his relationship with Israel and the ancient patriarchs, like it even says in the scriptures that Moses wrote of him. Well, yeah, Moses wrote of him, and there are, again, 217 allusions to the word of the Lord found in the first 5 books of the Pentateuch. But in the King James, there's 11 translations. And so, a lot of information that gets lost, that even in the Septuagint, you don't have that much as far as the allusion to Christ in these ancient manuscripts. They get lost. And so, in my opinion, that shows and affirms that it was when the translations went into the Greek and also into the Masoretic that they were removed. And so the Targum, which preserves all those, in my mind, it shows that it is very much older because these things were not altered um, until later. And as far as a Targum, the King James version of the Bible is a Targum. The
Right.
Greek Septuagint is a Targum. It
Right.
just means translation.
That's right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, again, it's my opinion that the Targum is very much older, and that when you look at and examine it, you see a lot of things that are removed, like the passage in Genesis 4:1 of Hava desiring the angel, which, I invite people to look at and listen to the first show that we did, because in my mind, it's very clear
Hmm.
from the King James and from the Targum and from even the Septuagint, as I cover in my book, The Great Contest 2, The Enmity Between the Seed Lines, that when you look at the Hebrew words and also the Greek and the parables of Matthew 13, it's very clear that the serpent beguiled Eve and that Cain was of the wicked one. And we went through all of that, so I'm not going to bring all that up tonight, but I'll actually share and cover when I get to some of the other points, like the apocalypse of Abraham and some of these other translations, as far as other ancient manuscripts, which also allude to these, some of the ancient commentary, books of commentary as well. But your second point, what was your second point? Oh, as far as Adam and Eve and
Hmm.
their bright nature. All right, so let's address that. And
Did you have any commentary on the scriptures from Genesis and Jubilees that I had offered to that
well,
point?
I'm going to go point by point first.
Well, that is this point what we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, as far as with regard to Genesis and Jubilees, Jubilees, in my opinion, it has a different take on what occurred within the scriptures, within the King James and the biblical canon. Um, and like with the twins, I mean, as far as Cain and Abel being born with sisters, that's not mentioned in the Bible. And so, I read those and I keep interest in them and I consider them, but I don't take that as scriptural.
But there's a lot of things that you presented in the Gospel of Bartholomew, the first book of Adam and Eve, and this Targum as well. Well, not quite the Targum, except for like the passage I showed where it claims that the angels were made on the second day. That is not in the Bible either. It's not in the King James. It's not in the Masoretic either.
Yeah, I
So
believe that
why would Jubilees be singled out?
were made on the first day with the creations of the heaven and the earth.
Okay, but the Targum said that they were made on the second day.
Well, I'd have to look at that, but I believe that they were made on the first day. And I'm not saying that everything, again, when we read and study from other sources, we have to consider out of the mouths of two or three witnesses shall the truth be established. And I really believe that that precedence has to be stood to when trying to affirm truth. And that the reason we study all these different books and all these different accounts is to get a better grasp in ideology on what is truth and what isn't. But again, when things contradict, because I know that even with the King James, as much as it's been altered and things removed out of it, I do know that it is inspired, and that the work of Ivan Panin, the mathematical code that he found in it, affirms the divine inspiration of the text. And I believe that the most ancient source of that is the Targum, and I do believe that the Septuagint also shows to us that the Word of God, these books are prophetic without a doubt. And also, one of my friends, Bill McGregor, he wrote a book called The Tuning Fork that shows that the 66 books of the King James version of the canon is prophetically and also divinely inspired, in that it aligns with the 66 books of the book of Isaiah. And this is a supernatural phenomenon which not a lot of people are aware of yet, but his work does affirm, that these manuscripts are inspired as well. But when it comes
Which
to
ones are you saying? These when you said these manuscripts, which ones are you referring to?
the King James Bible.
Oh, okay.
Now, with regard to Jasher and Jubilees and, the first book of Adam and Eve, I think these books are of interest in that we should look to them and read them and study from them, and they can give us insight into what is really going on within the biblical text, as far as the Targum and also the King James canon, but that we should stand on that which we know is without a doubt inspired and prophetic. And so I will, whenever something contradicts the Bible, I will always stand on the Bible as my foundational truth first and
Sure.
foremost.
Sure,
And
sure.
so,
Did did you know that the well there's I don't want to derail you. I apologize, man. I'll retract that. I don't want to derail you. Keep going. Or did you want to address another point?
yeah, I'm going to, as far as the bright nature of Adam and Eve and how you say that they were made physical.
That's what you
Well,
were saying. I was going off of what you were saying.
well, no, I said they were made bright and they were angelic and immortal and bright nature to begin with before they fell.
Yeah, but you quoted that from the first book of Adam and Eve.
Well,
And that
it's not just the first book of Adam and Eve, but as I said in the Targum version, and we covered this in the last show, that, if you read the Targum version, there's additional, and it shows to you that they were in paradise in the third heaven before they were cast down, and they were placed
well,
under the authority of death after they touched and ate the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God said to them, in the day that you eat thereof or touch, you shall die. And that's exactly what happened to them. They were placed under the authority of death, and they were cast out of the heavens, and they
can,
were banished here to the earth.
can we address that point? Because I didn't address it in my actual slides tonight, because like I said, I felt like it was like a supplemental part of the theory that I do not see validation for. And I just want to ask you a little bit further questions on when you talk about the Garden of Eden being in the third heaven that Adam was cast down from, I did see something alluding to that in the first book of Adam and Eve. But which book are you getting that from specifically?
Well, it's not just the first book of Adam and Eve, but also the Legends of the Jews, again, the Targum version of King James, and then you can find it in the King James. It's encoded into the Bible itself.
It's
And
encoded? What do you mean by that? It's encoded.
it's there, and it's encoded when you understand what is being spoken of. And again, that's why we have to look to some of these other, as far as storylines, to get a better understanding of what is actually there in the King James, just like with the serpent seed, because this also is still encoded in the King James Bible. But for those that haven't studied it or understood it or examined it in that way, it escapes them, and they don't, because nobody's teaching it, they don't understand it, and they've not read it or studied it in that manner. But the information is still there, just
Okay,
like
so
with the whole thing of biblical cosmology. You
well, help me
find that.
understand this. Help me understand this. This is the King James. And this is Genesis 2. And this is talking about the Garden of Eden. And it says that God planted, in verse 8, God planted a garden in Eden. So the garden itself is a separate concept that is put in the geographical region called Eden. And then in verse 10 through 14, a river came out of Eden to water the garden. So that's two different concepts. Eden's one geographical location. The garden, which was planted in it, is being watered by rivers that come out of the land. So if you're saying that the garden was in the third layer of the firmament in the third heaven, how does the water from the geographical land of Eden water that above?
The rivers come down to the earth and come into this world,
No, that's
but
not
they
what
all.
this says. This says the water came out of Eden, which is the land, and it watered the garden, which the garden was put in Eden.
All right, well, let me read you here a few verses then with regard to the differentiation between paradise and the Garden of Eden. First, we see in Revelation 2:7, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcome will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of paradise of God. So
Right.
we know that the tree of life is in paradise, and the tree of life is not on the earth, it's in
Right.
heaven.
Yeah, that's what Enoch says, that when
Yeah,
in chapter 25 and 20,
exactly.
24 and
Right,
25, he sees it and it's been transplanted to be given to the elect and the
right.
righteous. And
And
therefore,
that's exactly where Adam and Eve were before they were cast down, because God put the cherubim to protect the tree of life, because they were now in a fallen form. They were in flesh embodiment, and so he didn't want them to eat from the tree of life, because then they would have been in a fallen state forever. So
now
he put the cherubim.
I do understand that. Yeah, as far as the theological implications of them not eating while they're corrupted. But as far as the location itself, I just really struggle with this separating the Garden of Eden from the land of the Haaretz of the earth because of Genesis 2:8-14. But also, this is something where just food for thought because we disagree on this point, and so the viewer can maybe have a something else to chew on. Is that we've talked about and done entire videos on this channel about how the Garden of Eden is in the Hebrew that means a walled off area, the garden itself, and that it is brought down to the earth on day 3. It's when it was planted in, according to Jubilees and other passages, but then it was withdrawn from the earth, as Isaiah 54 speaks of, and then also 2nd Ezra chapter 7, verses 25 and 26, literally says the bride, which is withdrawn from the earth, and will return again, and that's what we see. And then Isaiah 49 verses 14-21 expound upon Isaiah 54, but in prefacing, explaining that this area, this garden Zion, has to be enlarged to accommodate everybody from the first resurrection, because as it was in its original nature as the garden that was planted in Eden, it was too small for all of its future inhabitants that are going to be part of the first resurrection. So therefore, that's why it has to be enlarged and expanded and beautified. That's why we see it so massive in Revelation 21 as it descends again, fulfilling the prophecy of 2nd Ezra 7:26. So that's our understanding of it. And Zen's got a little bit different take on it. That's fine, but that's why I struggle with some of the things that you're saying, brother.
Okay, well, that's fine. I'm going to give you clarity because paradise is not here on the earth. The Garden
Right.
of Eden, where they
Yes.
were cast down to, that's here on the earth because they were banished from the place of the immortals. And we see this distinction in several places. And I'll read you a couple of passages which affirms that paradise is different than the Garden of Eden they were cast down to. And this is found in
So wait, I'm not following. You're saying they were in the Garden of Eden that's above, but when they transgressed and ate of the fruit,
paradise. They were in paradise.
they were in paradise above, and then when they transgressed, ate the fruit, they then were kicked out and to the Garden of Eden down below.
Yes.
And that's where the story picks up in Genesis 2?
Genesis 3, yeah.
I guess I'm not seeing.
No, Genesis 3. It's after they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and after they take on mortal embodiment, and then when the tree of life is protected by the cherubim, that's when they're cast out of paradise.
Okay.
All right, so here, let me just read a few passages to show you that paradise is different, and that where they were before was above the vaulted dome of the earth, because that's where the place of the righteous is. That's where New Jerusalem resides even now. And that's why at the end, when Christ comes again, the harvest ensues. The paradise, New Jerusalem, will descend out of the heavens because it's not on the earth.
Now, I
It's in
think
the
you
heavens.
may be misunderstanding me. I agree with you. Paradise is in the third layer of the firmament. It's what Paul speaks of in 2 Corinthians 12. I'm saying what I was trying to explain was that I don't think there was two separated Garden of Edens, or there was not a paradise above. And then I'm trying to say that the Garden of Eden is paradise, and it was planted in the land of Eden on day 3, and then it was retracted, as Isaiah talks about, and then as 2nd Ezra talks about, and that's why it's being retracted to be enlarged to accommodate everyone of the first resurrection, and then it's going to be brought down in Revelation 21. That's the narrative. So I do agree with you that presently, the paradise, what we call paradise, is in the third layer of the firmament, and as the New Jerusalem, and it's waiting to come down. I guess where we disagree is where it was originally. I think that's maybe where we disagree.
No, I think what we are disagreeing on is that I'm saying that Adam and Eve, before they fell, lived in paradise, and that they were there in the heavens. And then after they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and took on mortal embodiment, they were cast down here to the earth. And there is a garden here, the Garden of Eden. And that's where they were banished to. And so that's what I'm going to show, that there is a distinction. And so I'm going to read 2 passages. This is from the 2nd book of Enoch. And there were by the bank of the river trees planted full of different fruits. And I looked towards the rising of the sun, and I saw there trees of great size, full of fruits. And that land was more brilliant than silver and gold. And there were vines growing on those date palms, and myriads of shoots and myriads of clusters on each branch. And I said to the archangel, "What is this, my Lord?" And he said to me, "This is the Archurasian lake, and within it the city of God. All are not permitted to enter into it, except whosoever shall repent of his sins. And as soon as he shall repent and alter his life, he is delivered to Michael, and they cast him into the Archurasian lake. And then he brings him into the city of God near the righteous." And I wondered, and I blessed God at all that I saw. And the angel said to me, "Follow me, that I may bring thee into the city of God and into its light." And its light was greater than the light of the world, and greater than gold, and walls encircled it, and the length and the breadth of it were 100 stadia. And I saw 12 gates exceedingly ornamented, leading into the city, and 4 rivers encircled it, flowing with milk, honey, oil, and wine. And I looked and saw in the midst of the city an altar great and very lofty. And there was one standing near the altar, whose face shone like the sun, and he had in his hands a psaltery and a harp. And he sung the Alleluia delightfully, and his voice filled all the city. And after these things the angel said to me, "Behold, thou hast seen all the torments. Come, follow me, that I may lead thee away to paradise, and thou mayest change thy soul by the sight of the righteous. For many desire to salute thee." And he took me by an impulse of the Spirit and brought me into paradise. And he said to me, "This is paradise where Adam and Eve transgressed. And I saw there a beautiful tree of great size, on which the Holy Spirit rested. And from the root of there came forth all manner of most sweet smelling water, parting into 4 channels. And I said to the angel, "My Lord, what is this tree that there comes forth from it a great abundance of this water? And where does it go?" And he answered and said to me, "Before the heaven and the earth existed, he divided them into 4 kingdoms and heads, of which their names are Pison, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. And having again taken hold of me by the hand, he led me near the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he said to me, This is the tree by means of which death came into the world. And Adam took of the fruit of it from his wife and ate. And thereafter they were cast out hence. And he showed me another, the tree of life, and said to me, This is the cherubim and the flaming sword guard." So that's that was from the vision of Paul. And this one is actually the one from the book of Enoch. But you see, again, it tells, Paul is shown that, where the tree of life is, that is paradise, and that is where the cherubim are located.
No, I
And
agree with
so,
that. But the vision of Paul would be New Testament era. That would be thousands of years after Adam and Eve, right? That means that it would already have been the moment where New Jerusalem was retracted from the earth, as 2 Ezra 7 talks about, and it would be placed up in the 3rd layer of the firmament, as Paul had a vision of.
well, I don't know about it being retracted, but I know that that's where it was when they were initially cast down, that they were there in paradise. So let me read this other description here.
And this one's from 2nd Enoch?
Yeah.
Okay.
"And those men took me thence and led me up onto the 3rd heaven and placed me there. And I looked downwards and saw the produce of these places, such as has never been known for goodness. And I saw all the sweet flowering trees, and beheld their fruits, which were sweet smelling, and all the foods borne by them bubbling with fragrant exaltation. And in the midst of the trees that of life, in that place whereon the Lord rests when he goes up into paradise. And this tree is of ineffable goodness and fragrance, and adorned more than every existing thing, and on all sides it is in form gold-looking and vermilion and fire-like, and covers all, and it has produce from all fruits. Its root is in the garden and the earth's end, and paradise is between corruptibility and incorruptibility. And two springs come out which send forth honey and milk, and their springs send forth oil and wine, and they separate into four parts, and go round with quiet course, and go down into the paradise of Eden, between corruptibility and incorruptibility. And thence they go forth along the earth and have a revolution to their circle, even as other elements. And here there is no unfruitful tree, and every place is blessed. And there are 300 angels very bright, who keep the garden, and with incessant sweet singing and never silent voices serve the Lord throughout all days and hours. That's chapter 8, the book of the secrets of Enoch. Um, Here's another one from the Apocalypse of Peter about paradise as well. And it says, "And the Lord showed me a very great country outside of this world, exceedingly bright with light, and the air there lighted up with the rays of the sun, and the earth itself blooming with unfading flowers and full of spices and plants, fair flowering and incorruptible, and bearing blessed fruit. And so great was the perfume that it was borne thence even unto us. And the dwellers in that place were clad in the raiment of shining angels, and their raiment was like unto their country, and angels hovered about them there. And the glory of the dwellers there was equal, and with one voice they sang praises alternately to the Lord God, rejoicing in that place. The Lord saith to us, This is the place of your high priest, the righteous men." And so that's the Apocalypse of Peter. I'll read one other passage about paradise. This is from On the Origin of the World.
Now,
And
are
then
any
I'll,
of these, brother, are any of these passages clearly differentiating that paradise was in Genesis, the beginning, in the beginning, that we read from Genesis 1 through 3, that paradise was separate from the land of Eden on the ground?
well, yeah, it was in the heaven, and it's telling you that, there's a distinction, there's a differentiation between paradise on the ground, as you say, here on the earth, because I don't believe that paradise is
I
here
didn't
on the
I
earth.
didn't say that. No, I didn't say that. I was saying that from Genesis chapter 2, 8 through 14, it tells us that the Lord planted a garden eastward in the land of Eden, and then he put the man whom he formed in that garden.
Right, and that is in paradise above in the third heaven.
So now Eden,
That's
the
not on
geographical
the earth.
area. So you're saying Eden, the geographical area in Genesis 2, is not on the ground, but is in the heaven above?
That's right, exactly.
Okay, that's fine. Well, we definitely disagree on that, but I now understand what you're saying. I apologize. I wasn't catching that point earlier.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
that's why we're,
Yeah,
doing this.
that's why we're doing it. That's right.
Yeah. All
So
right. And so I'll share this one last thing, and then we'll talk about, you know, Adam and Eve losing their bright nature. And again, in my opinion, it's because they were cast down and they took on mortal flesh form. They came under the authority of death, and that's why they are here on the earth where the fallen angels were already cast down to previously. All right. This last one, on the origin of the world. Then justice created paradise, being beautiful and being outside the orbit of the moon and orbit of the sun, in the land of wantonness, in the east, in the midst of the stones. And desire is the midst of the beautiful, appetizing trees. And the tree of eternal life is as it appeared by God's will to the north of paradise, so that it might make eternal the souls of the pure, who shall come forth from the mottled forms of poverty at the consummation of the age. Now the color of the tree of life is like the sun, and its branches are beautiful. Its leaves are like those of the cypress. Its fruit is like a bunch of grapes when it is white. Its height goes as far as heaven, and next to it is the tree of the knowledge of Gnosis, having the strength of God. Its glory is like the moon when fully radiant, and its branches are beautiful. Its leaves are like fig leaves. Its fruit is like a good appetizing date. And this tree is to the north of paradise, so that it might arouse the souls from the torpor of the demons, in order that they might approach the tree of life and eat of its fruit, and so condemn the authorities and their angels. The effect of this tree is described in the sacred book. It is you who are the tree of knowledge, which is in paradise, from which the first man ate, and which opened his mind. And he loved his female counterpart and condemned the other, alien likeness, and loathed them. This is talking about Satan and the legion, because when they were cast down, they found themselves surrounded by these devils and demons.
When do you think they were cast down again?
Right after they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
I know. I apologize.
Right after the punishments.
I apologize.
Where you see,
I meant to ask about the angels.
Oh, the second day is what it says in chapter 29 and 30 in the book of Enoch, the second book of Enoch, and also in the testaments of the patriarchs and the prophets. It says they were cast down on the second day. Chapter 29 and 30, second Enoch.
Second Enoch. Okay, I'll have to go check that out later.
I can read it for you right now if you want.
Well, I didn't know if you had other points that you wanted to get to, because that's still kind of a supplementary. Whether they're cast down or not, they could still accomplish the serpent seed theory, in Genesis 3. So I didn't want to. I just want to make sure you have enough time to get some of these points.
Yeah, we'll go through all your points because I want to be able to cover them. All right, and so as far as the
So wait a minute though, brother. I thought you were saying that, like, some of the stuff that you just read, like the Apocalypse of Paul,
Apocalypse of Peter.
Well, you read from the Apocalypse of Paul first, then Second Enoch.
The Vision of Paul.
The Vision of Paul. Okay, isn't that the same thing as the Apocalypse of Paul?
No,
it's not. Okay, where's the Vision of Paul? Where's that book come from?
It was discovered by somebody that had lived in the house of Paul, and the person kept having dreams. Like the Holy Spirit kept giving him the dreams to dig up under this particular portion of the house, and that's where it was discovered.
In the house of Paul, like in Jerusalem or something, or in
Rome?
Rome?
Something of that nature. Yeah.
Okay, I'll have to go check that out. But none of that stuff that you just read is in the canonization books. Now, I'm not a big fan.
That's not true.
Well, I'm just saying I'm not a big fan of the canon, as far as us giving the authority to men to say which book should be validated or not.
Well, yeah, I'm not either. But...
I mean, I think we should test each book on its own merit.
I agree.
If there's a common thematic and theological consistency that would line up with Deuteronomy 13. But all I'm saying though is some of these additional stuff that you're reading, I'm not hearing the specific differentiation of the Garden of Eden being specifically in a different place in Genesis 2 and 3. And much of the stuff that you're reading from, I have looked at many of these books, and just for the viewer to understand, he's presenting a different viewpoint, guys. Many of these books that I have never shared on my channel before, because either I'm still studying through them or I don't agree with them at all. So that's why we're doing this this is a little bit different for a lot of the people in the chat that might be wondering what's going on. So,
Well, I've read a lot of everything. I've studied everything and read most of what you can find out there. And anyways, again, with regard to paradise, we are told in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul tells us that paradise is in the third heaven. He was taken there, given the vision, and shown the city of God. And in my opinion, that book that I was quoting from, the Vision of Paul, that elaborates and gives you full detail on what his vision was.
No, wait a minute. You just said in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul was...
2 Corinthians chapter 11, somewhere thereabouts, he says that he had a vision and he was taken to paradise and it was in the third heaven.
Yeah, that's in chapter 12, verse 1 through 3, but it doesn't say he was... Okay, I see what you're saying. So you're just
So paradise is in the third heaven.
No,
This is
I
what I'm
agree
saying.
with you. Yeah, I agree with that for sure. That's what it says clearly. That's where the New Jerusalem comes down from.
Right.
In my understanding, that is the woman clothed with the sun in Revelation 12. But I know not everyone agrees with that. But I just want to make sure, because you had added some extra detail there that's not in these 3 verses. I just want to make sure that you weren't adding from one of those books you just read from. You said that Paul saw a city, or did he see the garden?
No, he saw paradise, and he saw the city of God, which you said you haven't read the vision of Paul yet, but when
So
you do,
you
it
are pulling from the vision of Paul to.
yeah.
I just want to make sure, brother. That's all. That's all.
Yeah, I read a quote from that, just a little bit ago.
Mhm.
Uh,
Okay.
and so, the whole point that I'm approaching now is you said that, that Adam and Eve were not, that they were created as flesh.
Right. I didn't.
And
Genesis and Jubilees say it.
well, I don't believe Genesis is saying that. I believe Genesis is telling us that they were created with a bright nature, just as all these other texts stated, and that when they were cast out after eating, which again, I'm going to go to through these verses to show you that they did lose their bright nature. And then afterwards, even with being able to walk, and then they took on digestive systems, and then they
And
didn't
that,
even know the experience of hot or cold, and they had never drank water.
right.
And it's
You're
because they were in,
first Adam and Eve.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's where I was showing on screen here, Genesis 2:7, that they're formed of the dust of the ground.
Okay, well, let me read some other passages and then we'll see. Well, yeah, I do agree. Their bodies were created of the dust of the ground, but their spirits were blown into these bodies. Well, Adam's body was, not Eve, because Eve was taken as a rib out of Adam. But Adam was not, even though his body was created from the dust, he wasn't here on the earth. He was in paradise. That's where he fell from. And he had a bright nature before he took on and became a complete human, as far as under the authority of death. And I told you about the distinction, you know, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, that they did not have yet the blood within them until after they fell and took on mortal embodiment. And that's also when their genitals appear, and that's when Eve was seduced and impregnated with Cain by the serpent.
Yeah, I know that's what you said. Unfortunately, I disagree with much of it. But and I think I asked you last time about the idea of them not having genitals, according to the theory that you're proposing, that they did not have genitals until they had sinned, and then blood went in their body, and then they started forming vital organs and everything, and so they basically became the human being that we know and see today. But I would disagree from the text I presented tonight, as well as the idea of what spiritual beings are. This is what I was trying to explain a little bit last time, that Jubilees 15:27 tells us that the angels were created with male members. They were created with penises on day 1, and they were circumcised the day of their creation. And this is the angels in heaven, which is how they can even come to the earth as spiritual beings, yet they're made of a flesh that's not from the dust of the earth, it's from water. And they do have a body with fully working excretory and reproductive systems, and that's how they can impregnate the ladies that they took, as we read from Genesis, Jubilees, and Jasher.
Can you read that passage where you
Oh, for
say
sure.
that they were
Yeah,
made with genitals?
for sure. I'll go there real quick. It's in 15:27. And as circumcision is being explained to Abraham, it says, "For the angels of the presence, all the angels of sanctification, have so been created from the day of their creation. And before the angels of the presence, the angels of sanctification, he has sanctified Israel, that they should be with him and with his holy angels." And he's talking about everyone who's born of the flesh, who's not circumcised. They need to be circumcised. It's the part of the covenant. It is an eternal ordinance. And that's why he's saying, for all the angels who keep the same covenant in heaven, follow the same ordinance. They were all created in their day, already circumcised. This is why in Ezekiel 44, we have Yahweh expressing through Ezekiel that during the millennial reign, in his house, in verse 7 through 9, verse 9 specifically, He says, "Thus saith the Lord God: No stranger, uncircumcised in heart nor in flesh, nor uncircumcised in flesh, shall enter my sanctuary of any stranger that is among the children of Israel." So this is an idea where when we're resurrected, this circumcision deal is a part of, perfected nature, if you will. And this is why mankind, who's born imperfect, is asked to do it as a sign of the covenant. And therefore, these angels who are created perfect in heaven above were already done that way. And then everyone that'll be resurrected and in his house, and even the strangers who would want to come in and minister unto his house or visit for the feasts during the millennial reign, they're going to have to be circumcised too. This is why you can't celebrate Passover without being circumcised. And it's a big deal to the Father, both circumcised in your behavior in your heart and also your physical flesh. And all of his angels have been circumcised in their flesh and should be in their heart. Obviously, we see some rebel in the book of Enoch. So that's why I say that they do have bodies. That's how they could actually impregnate women. They do have fully functioning working bodies. That's why they eat food with Abraham. That's why Yeshua in his resurrected body is able to eat food with his disciples. And it just didn't fall to the ground. Like they do have a physical, tangible substance. It's just made of a different nature. We're made of dust in the breath of life, and they're made of water in the breath of life. That's why they have more ability to go throughout the entire creation than we do. That's the other point of contrast that I would have with your theory, is that you were talking about Adam being placed in the third heaven. And that's where I was saying, like, your caveat that you put in the theory is that he didn't have flesh yet. He had a light body, and that's why he could be up there. And that's where, Enoch chapter 10 or chapter 15 talks about things that are created on the earth are meant to live on the earth, and things that are created in the heavens above are meant to live in the heavens above. Those are not my words. Those are Yahweh's in Enoch 15. So that's why I struggle so badly with this two Garden of Eden idea, because Adam was as Genesis 2:7, Jubilees 3:8 says, that he was made from the dust of the earth, and that way we're supposed to live on the earth. So that's where I would fundamentally and theologically disagree with the theory.
Okay, well, that's fine. But, again, I'll show that you're wrong in that regard. And then with regard to this whole thing of these angels being, I didn't hear anything about them being created with penises.
Yeah,
I know with regard to the Watchers that they were given bodies of flesh. They were placed into bodies of flesh when they were allowed to come down here to the earth. And that's why they were able to sleep with the daughters of Cain and impregnate them. But why would angels have penises if they don't?
I just read it, brother. It's in Jubilees 15. It's explaining circumcision to Abraham. And in the context of these 4 or 5 verses, it's explaining that the angels were created this way from the day of their creation.
Well,
and it's specifically explaining circumcision.
Yeah, but couldn't circumcision be that they were created without penises, and that would represent circumcision in the same way? Because why would angels have to have genitals if they don't multiply, they don't replicate? That's why Christ said, the angels in heaven are not given in marriage.
But it doesn't say they couldn't. I mean, obviously they came to the earth, took wives, and that was not appointed for them, as explained in Enoch.
We can go into that story, and I can show you how the Watchers, that was a different. They were given bodies of flesh.
So then Azazel took on a body of flesh in order to impregnate Eve?
And Azazel he possessed the serpent and took on the appearance and the body and of the serpent, who was.
So the serpent impregnated Eve, not the angel. Is that what you're proposing?
It was Azazel through the body of the serpent.
So a serpent's literal snake DNA impregnated Eve, and
it was not a snake. It was a basilisk. It was said to be a feathered serpent, a winged serpent. He had arms and legs, and this creature was compatible and was able to impregnate Eve.
Okay.
And that's why Cain came about from that. But Satan had to possess the serpent in order to get back into the garden, because he had already been cast down and kicked out. But let's finish this whole thing with regard to the differentiation as far as Adam being bright-natured. And I'll just share some passages again from the first book of Adam and Eve. As you shared the one, because yeah, I do agree his body was made of dust, but that doesn't mean he was living here on the earth. And the Lord said to Adam and Eve, you transgressed of your own free will until you came out of the garden in which I had placed you. Of your own free will have you transgressed through your desire for divinity, greatness, and an exalted state, such as I have, so that I deprived you of the bright nature in which you then were. And I made you come out of the garden to this land, rough and full of trouble. And, again, that shows that they had lost their bright nature, but we'll continue some other passages. But Adam and Eve cried for having come out of the garden, their first home. And indeed, when Adam looked at his flesh that was altered, he cried bitterly, he and Eve, over what they had done. And they walked and went gently down into the cave of treasures. And as they came to it, Adam cried over himself and said to Eve, look at this cave that is to be our prison in this world and a place of punishment. What is it compared with the garden? What is its narrowness compared with the space of the other? What is this rock by the side of those groves? What is the gloom of this cavern compared with the light of the garden? What is this overhanging ledge of rock to shelter us, compared with the mercy of the Lord that overshadowed us? What is the soil of this cave compared with the garden land, this earth strewed with stones, and that planted with delicious fruit trees? And Adam said to Eve, look at your eyes and at mine, which before beheld angels praising in heaven, and they too without ceasing. But now we do not see as we did. Our eyes have become of flesh. They cannot see like they used to see before. Adam said again to Eve, what is our body today compared to what it was in former days when we lived in the garden? And then after this, Adam did not want her to enter the rock cave under the hanging rock, nor would he ever want to enter it. But he bowed to God's orders and said to himself, unless I enter the cave, I shall be a transgressor. And so, again, his eyes, they used to be able to see, hear the angels, speak with them directly when they had a bright nature. And then after they took on mortal form, they lost this ability, as they lost so many. So I'm going to continue reading. Then Adam cried and said, oh God, when we lived in the garden and our hearts were lifted up, we saw the angels that sang praises in heaven. But now we can't see like we used to. No, when we entered the cave, all creation became hidden from us. And then God, the Lord, said to Adam, when you were under subjection to me, you had a bright nature within you, and for that reason could you see things far away. But after your transgression, your bright nature was withdrawn from you, and it was not left to you to see things far away, but only near at hand, after the ability of the flesh, for it is brutish. A few more.
Okay. Brother, do you believe the first book of Adam and Eve and the second book of Adam and Eve are one consistent work of literature?
I do believe that, yeah, they make up a full story of, the first transition of Adam and Eve here to the earth, and then the generations that came out after that. But
were you aware that the second book of Adam and Eve says that the Garden of Eden was 15 cubits above them and they could see it from the ground?
I think that would probably be paradise. And again, when Adam, and I'm not, one of the other things that you said, as far as, I didn't say all the generations of Adam were as big as he was. It does say in the Gospel of Bartholomew that Adam was 80 cubits and Eve was 50. But all of the others that were the 10 generations after him reduced in stature, and they became smaller. And only Adam was that large of size. And I don't even know if again that is
No,
true or not.
I
Because
wasn't really talking about their stature size at that question. I was asking about the placement of where you think that the paradise was a different place in the third heaven.
yeah, but
Um,
I'm addressing something else that you said in one of your points,
okay,
which
I'm
we'll get
sorry.
to later.
Okay,
All right,
well,
let's continue. O spirits who wait on God, look at me and at my being unable to see you, or when I was in my former bright nature. Then I could see you, and I sang praises as you do, and my heart was far above you. But now that I have transgressed that bright nature, it is gone from me, and I am come to this miserable state. And now I have come to this, that I cannot see you, and you do not serve me like you used to, for I have become animal flesh. And so again, they are now in mortal human embodiment, and they were cast down here to the earth. They were, and this is clear in from the first books of Adam and Eve as well, that they were cast out of paradise. And there's several other books which also confirm this. I'm going to read just a few other things to show you.
brother, the second book of Adam and Eve, it does, it makes a lot of, the first book of Adam and Eve makes a lot of things that I find contrary to Genesis, the storyline as a whole, as well as Jubilees. But the second book of Adam and Eve makes even more egregious claims, even to the point where it denies the Nephilim. It denies the incursion of the Watchers taking wives and having children by them. And it just goes with the Sethite theory that we hear from seminaries. So this is where I struggle so much
Well,
with
out of
these
the mouths
books.
of two or three witnesses. I'm not saying everything in the first book and second book of Adam and Eve is correct, especially when it comes to, because we know that it was the angels that took the daughters of Cain and created the race of giants, and they were a completely different hybrid race. And if you have humans copulating with other humans, you would not get that. And so, with any of these books, we are reading them for insight, but you don't take everything, especially when it contradicts the Bible. It's out of the mouths of two or three witnesses shall the truth be established. And that should be the precedent that we always look to when reading and studying from these other manuscripts. But let me continue, because I want to get to all of your other points as well. But I need to make this point before moving on. This right here, this passage shows that they didn't even understand how to walk when they were in their bright nature, which in my mind shows that, like we move in dreams, we have to use our will to go forth, and that walking is something that is also of, a fallen, because we're in a fallen state. This is from chapter 2. But when our father Adam and Eve went out of the garden, they walked around on their feet, not knowing they were walking. And when they came to the opening of the gate of the garden and saw the broad earth spread before them, covered with stones large and small, with sand, they feared and trembled and fell on their faces from the fear that came over them, and they were as dead. Because whereas until this time they had been in the garden land, which is paradise, beautifully planted with all manner of trees, they now saw themselves in a strange land. And so again, they were cast out and they were banished here to the earth. And that was the strange land that this is being talked about. Now, I'm just going to read a couple other passages about how they did not, they used to not drink water, they used to not eat food, they did not experience cold and darkness. And then we can move on to your other points. And Adam
So
cried.
wait a minute. How can they not eat or drink if their sin was eating of the apple or eating of the fruit?
Well, they didn't digest food in the manner, just like with heavenly manna. The angels eat as well, but that doesn't mean they have flesh bodies.
Isn't that an assumption though? Because Yeshua in his resurrected fleshly body that Thomas touched in John 20, he ate food in front of him. He hugged people. He was touched. He had a digestive system, right? And he promises us in Luke 20:36 that we're made like the angels at the resurrection.
Yeah, he was in mortal form. Christ came in and took embodiment within the flesh.
No, he was resurrected. I'm talking about after he was resurrected in his glorified body, the one that can ascend through the layers of the firmament, Hebrews 4:14, actually go and be, as Hebrews 1 says, the greater authority than even the angels in heaven, take on his priesthood position where he ministers before us, that he has a real body that Thomas touched. I mean, he made breakfast for the disciples on the lakeside that morning, cooking real tangible food with them. And I guess I'm really struggling with leaning on this text because of this idea that these spirit bodies were interacting, and that the rules are so malleable, and how you're applying what applies to them and what doesn't. Because I'm seeing so much in the rest of Scripture that you and I both consider valid that would contradict it.
Well, again, I'm just reading from what the scriptures say, and I'm just telling you that there was a differentiation between where they were and how they were to what they came to be after the fall. And that's the point that I'm making, because you're saying that they were only flesh. They didn't have a bright nature, and they weren't living above the vaulted dome before they were cast out. And so I'm showing you that that's incorrect according to the story. And
Well,
that,
according to this particular book of Adam and Eve,
well, yeah,
that's according. Yeah,
I can, quote other books as well. I'm just sharing from this because
sure.
I didn't know of all the things that you were going to say tonight, but I have
Right.
some of this material already set aside, and so I was able to pull it up quickly.
I think my co-host of Honor of Kings is going to be jealous tonight that you and I are basically doing an Honor of Kings episode on the book of First Adam and Eve. If you're out there watching, Ken, it's all good, brother.
All right, so I'm going to just read these really quickly again with regard to
Okay.
the water and stuff. And he said to Eve, "Do you not see this water that was with us in the garden, that watered the trees of the garden and flowed out from there? And we, when we were in the garden, did not care about it. But since we came to this strange land, we love it and turn it to use for our body." Another one. And Adam said, after he was raised, "O God, while we were in the garden, we did not require or care for this water. But since we came to this land, we cannot do without it." Then God said to Adam, "While you were under my command and were a bright angel, you knew not this water. But now that you have transgressed my commandment, you cannot do without water, wherein to wash your body and to make it grow. For it is now like that of the beasts, and is in want of water." This is about the hunger. But Adam has said to Eve, "I am afraid to eat of this fig. I know not what may come over me from it." So Adam cried and stood praying before God, saying, "Satisfy my hunger without my having to eat this fig. For after I have eaten it, what will it profit me? And what shall I desire and ask of you, O God, when it is gone?" And he said, "I am afraid to eat of it, for I know not what will befall me through it." Another couple passages with the same theme in mind. Then the word of God came to Adam and said to him, "O Adam, why didn't you have this dread of this fasting or this care before now? And why didn't you have this fear before you transgressed? But when you came to live in this strange land, your animal body could not survive on earth without earthly food to strengthen it and to restore its powers." And so, again, they were cast out of paradise. They're banished here to the earth where they have an animal body. They lose their bright nature and thus have to take on all of the things that are required of us in having flesh embodiment. "O Lord, when I was in the garden and saw the water that flowed from under the tree of life, my heart did not desire, neither did my body require to drink of it. Neither did I know thirst, for I was living in above that which I am now. So that in order to live, I did not require any food of life, neither did I drink of the water of life. But now, O God, I am dead. My flesh is parched with thirst. Give me of the water of life, that I may drink of it and live.
Okay.
And the angel said to Adam and Eve, God says to you that you do not have the strength that would be required to fast until death. Eat, therefore, and strengthen your bodies, for you are now animal flesh and cannot subsist without food and drink. So, again, so many verses, and I'll just stop there because I know we need to move on to the other stuff, and I want to be able to approach that as well. But, it also says about how they had never experienced night and day and the experience of heat and cold um, because they were not in flesh embodiment. But let's move on to your third point. What was the, what
I'll
was
put on the screen here that Cain and Abel were, you claim they were twins from double pregnancy from two different dads, but I presented several texts that does not say that at all.
okay? Yeah, let me go ahead and let me pull up something here. And I'll go to the beginning of All right, I'm going to start with because I already have this laid out as far as some other texts.
Now, brother, I just want to respectfully, I want to say you laid out a lot of these texts on the first time, the part one that we did a few weeks ago.
Not what I'm about to go into.
Okay.
I didn't cover any because in the first show, I kept it strictly from the King James because I wanted to establish it as foundation from the King James.
You read from the book of Bees. You read from the Legend of the Jews. You read from commentary from the 17th and the 19th century. You read from the first book of Adam and Eve. You read from the Jerusalem Targum in our first episode.
Right, but I was focused in the first part of going through the story of the fall of humanity from the King James and from the Targum. And then I added in all the other stuff to confirm what I was saying from the foundation of the canon first. And then the parables, Matthew 13, all of that, the enemy that snuck in the garden, that sowed the terror.
Well, see, the thing about all this stuff in the New Testament and the wording that I try to address the wording in part one briefly, just to say that, the terminology of being the seed of, the father or the seed of the serpent, it can be aligned with a person's behavior, whether they're doing covenant behavior or not. And I know that you didn't agree with that, and that's fine. But that's why I addressed tonight all these claims dealing strictly with the Genesis, the beginning passages, whether it's Genesis or Jubilees or the book of First Adam and Eve, where it specifically talks about the impregnation moment with Cain and Abel, that whole concept. Because if that can be proven true, then there's more credence to all the speculation added onto it from the New Testament passages. But if we can't find just direct, clear-cut wording from the story at the beginning, then everything that we're adding on at the end is just speculation that has no underpinning, has no foundation. So that's where I'll let you keep addressing these claims, because I think it would be important for the viewers to see. But just so the viewers know, the reason why I'm starting with these claims at the beginning of the storyline is because any speculatory, you are, John chapter 8, you're of your father the devil, Cain was of the wicked one, any of those statements in the New Testament, that's all built upon a presupposition that this theory in Genesis is true. So That's what I wanted to really address with Zen tonight. So
that's exactly right. That's why it's important to go through Genesis 3 as we did in the first show, and how it was that when they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you have the punishments that were brought forth. And God said to the serpent that I'm going to put enmity between your seed and her seed, between your son and thy sons.
Right. But again, if she did not get impregnated by Satan, then that terminology means something different. That's why I showed all the things I did with the scriptures I showed tonight, that the only thing that even slightly alludes to the serpent physically, sexually taking Eve is the Jerusalem Targum from one little phrase. And that's the same Targum that has admittedly been revised over time. So
you say so, but that's not true.
No, I pulled that information from, people that have analyzed the texts, all the professional commentary on the text.
The professional commentators. Yeah. Again, I have differences of opinions with them and with you. And anybody, again, go listen to the first show that we did on this, where I laid it out from the King James, from the Targum, explained all the words and the punishments, because Eve eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge good and evil, and then the punishments that are brought forth is that she would bear children in sorrow. So how does why is it that God's saying she's going to bear children if she's not pregnant? And how does the serpent have seed if he didn't impregnate her with Cain, who was again of the wicked one? And Christ tells us,
yeah.
you know,
That's what I was trying to say. It's all built upon the assumption of the act.
it's not an
of,
assumption. It's right there, plain as day.
Well, I'm saying what you're thinking of, the seed, her seed will crush the head of your seed, and that whole phraseology and verbiage is built upon the assumption that the serpent physically, sexually had a moment with Eve, and then you've added to that by saying, and then Adam did the same thing with Eve, and that's where we're looking at claim 3 tonight with the double pregnancy.
Exactly. Yes. And so please, people, go listen to the first show, because it's only when you understand that there was a sexual beguilement, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 and 3, where he speaks about the serpent's beguilement of Eve, that's what caused her to lose her chastity, that a woman can only lose her chastity when she's physically, sexually corrupted. And that's exactly what happened. And so that's why we see again that when God said to the serpent, I'm going to put enmity between your seed and her seed, that the serpent is going to have children. He's going to have seed. And this next passage that we're going to go into.
Well, before you do that real quick, I'm sorry to interrupt you, brother. Before you go into that next passage real quick, in that place in Genesis 3:15 that you're repeating about the woman, do you claim that the serpent took the chastity of Eve? Would that pose a serious legal problem for Adam to take her as his wife?
No.
Should not she be killed for bestiality and adultery at the same time?
Well, I am no judge on that. All I can say is that she was his wife, and she was an adulteress, which is something else that comes up in this next passage. As far as why the punishment and why she wasn't killed for all that, that's between God and Adam and her. But she wasn't. She bore children, and she became the mother of all the living. She bore the serpent seed and the woman's seed. And that's why there would be enmity between them. And the punishment that was given to Adam was that he was going to have to work the soil to bring forth sustenance, to have to feed his family that would come forth because Eve was pregnant. And so this passage right here is going to clarify some of all that, because it's only by understanding it in the manner that I'm presenting it that this passage even makes in any manner any sense. It says, he who has been created is beautiful, but you would not find his son's noble creations. If he were not created, but begotten, you would find that his seed was noble. But now he was created, and he begot. What nobility is this? First, adultery came into being, afterward, murder. And he was begotten in adultery, for he was the child of the serpent. And so he became a murderer, just like his father, and he killed his brother. And so I'm going to explain this passage because I know a lot of people.
Where are you reading from?
This is from the Gospel of Philip. All right, the first verse. He who has been created is beautiful. This particular passage is alluding to Satan, Lucifer, the most created first and foremost archangel. And we know that because he was an angel, he was a created being. And so he who has been created is beautiful, but you would not find his sons noble creations. Why are his sons not noble creation? Because he's an angel. And as it says in the next verse, if he were not created, meaning that if he were not an angel, but begotten and born of woman, then his seed would be noble, meaning that they would be normal human children. If he were not created but begotten, you would find that his seed was noble. But now he was created and he begot. What nobility is this? And so this passage is telling you that Satan, because he was a created angel, he was never supposed to bear children. But if he would have been born of woman, then that would have been okay. But he was not born of woman, and yet he begot anyways, meaning that he had children and he brought forth progeny. And so it says, what nobility is this? First, adultery came into being, afterward murder. That's exactly what happened, because the serpent beguiling Eve, that was an adulterous act. Adam sat by, he didn't know what was going on. The serpent pounced upon Eve, impregnated her with Cain, and then he, repeating the act and eating the fruit with her, he impregnated her with Abel. And that's why when we get to Genesis 3:15, we see that God tells the serpent, well, I'm going to put enmity between your seed and her seed, meaning that both of them are going to have children and progeny. And that's why we see that Cain is left out of the genealogies of Christ. His children and his first 10 generations are found in Genesis chapter 4. And Adam's children, because Abel was murdered by his half brother Cain, is he had Seth, whose name means replacement, compensation, and substitution. And it would be through Seth that Adam would bear his children and his future progeny.
I thought Seth meant appointed.
No, Cain means appointed. Cain means appointed and also.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I'm sorry. You're right.
Yeah. All right. And so continuing. And then, so first adultery came into being, and then afterward murder. And so the adultery is the serpent beguiling Eve, impregnating her with Cain. And then when Cain was born as the firstborn of the wicked one, as it says in First John, and as Christ alluded to, that the devil is the father of the tares, and Cain was the first tare. Then murder, because he killed his half brother. And so that's why it says here in the rest of this passage, and he was begotten in adultery. This is Cain, for he was a child of the serpent. I mean, you can't get around that. He was a child of the serpent.
And that's if we take the Gospel of Philip as a legit text to consider.
Even if you discount this, it's found in the Bible as well.
Well, that's the debate we're having, though, right? Is that it's not found, and that's what I was trying to show tonight. That even the Book of Jubilees clearly differentiates a 63-year gap between them leaving the garden and Cain being impregnated or Cain being conceived. So this is where even the book of First Adam and Eve claims that Cain was not the twin of Abel, and that Satan is not the father of either one of them.
Well, even if Cain wasn't the twin, which again, that to me is not biblical, and that's not what the Bible says, because clearly it says that there would be the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent would be born, and in the Targum it says that thy son and her sons, meaning that Cain would be of the serpent seed, as it says in this verse. And then because he kills Abel, Seth would have to bring forth Adam's children, and that it would be.
Here's I'm piecing together everything you're saying, and I'm getting a better framework of the case that you're making from both episodes that we've done now. And you've said multiple times that the theory that you're talking about is that the paradise that Adam and Eve were in when they took of the fruit was in the third heaven, and that's where Satan went to them. Am I hearing that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And then when they took of the fruit, you're claiming that in that moment they were in these spiritual bodies, and that's when the serpent was taken over by Satan to eat of the fruit, and at the same time a sexual act was done.
The Satan had to enter into the serpent before
Gotcha.
he went into
So you're saying that the serpent engaged in a sexual act with Eve to impregnate her, and then Adam turned at the same moment or on the same day after eating the fruit too and engaged in a sexual act with her.
Right.
But you've emphatically tried to make a case earlier that they did not have real bodies, nor did they have sexual organs at that time period.
They ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And when they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as God said, that in the day you eat thereof, you shall die, meaning that they would then be put into flesh embodiment. And so when they ate from that tree, that's when they took on mortal flesh. That's when their genitals appear. That's when the serpent beguiling Eve impregnated her with Cain. And then that's why when they covered their genitals with the fig leaves, they know that they have broken the commandment, and they go and hide themselves from God. And then God calls them forth from their hiding places. And then that's when the punishments are given to the serpent, to Eve, and to Adam.
Okay. So basically, regardless of the text that I've showed tonight, from the wording of the Jerusalem Targum and that inserted phrase where it says that she desired the angel, even though that could mean a variety of things, the word desired in Hebrew and Aramaic has more than one meaning. Also, you're using that text plus the Gospel of Philip to directly equate that this serpent impregnated Eve and created the twins of Cain and Abel. While we do not get that from the Masoretic, the Septuagint, Jubilees, Jasher, or the first book of Adam and Eve. Is that correct?
That's your opinion.
That's what I was trying to show from the research of this theory. So I'm just saying, if we're going to take a testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, which one do we take?
Well, you take the truth, but you're misinterpreting it, and you're denying that this is found in all of those texts when it clearly is.
It's literally not, though. That's the problem. The first book, I don't even agree with the first book in Adam and Eve, but it literally doesn't say that.
But anybody that listens to this and listens to the first show, and as you look into the commentaries, clearly most other people can see it, even though you can't. And those that choose to deny it, like yourself, not being able to see it, but clearly many other people can. I see very clearly as well, and it is found in the Septuagint. It is found in the King James. It is found in all of these other manuscripts.
All I'm seeing is the point that I brought up earlier, where as I came through this, and it's over and over and over again, it says that Adam knew his wife. Adam knew his wife. Adam knew his wife. Even in the Targum, Jasher, Book of Adam and Eve, the Masoretic, the Septuagint, Jubilees specifically says 63 years after they were expelled from the garden, Cain was conceived. So all of these texts do not, in my understanding, from my reading of the text, it does not support this. But we already knew that going into this. I just want to make sure that there's people in the audience asking questions, and some of them are good questions, some are malformed. But I just want to make sure that people understand that you're reading from a lot of different texts that they've never heard of before. That's one thing. It's not like a bad issue, but I just want them to be aware that what you're calling scripture, many of the people in the audience may not be calling scripture. So this is where some people are a little confused about what's happening.
Yeah, that's fine. And again, that's why I say to go and listen to the first show, because in that first show, I laid it out from the King James first, and that is the foundation for this truth. All right, we're just gonna move on. I'm gonna bring up a couple other things here from some commentary, so that people can understand. Because you say that
the remaining points.
What's that?
You want to address the remaining points?
No, I'm going to address this one first. This one about Cain not being a child of the serpents, because.
Well, I think the point that we were on was that Cain was the twin of Abel. That's what you were talking about originally.
Well, even if he's not, which again, in my opinion, it's clear that in the King James and the Targum, that's what it says. But these other books, Jubilees and Jasher, or the first book of Adam and Eve, they say that Cain and Abel were not twins and they were born with twin sisters. But again, that's not what I see in the Bible. And so, you can take that as scriptural, but I don't. But anyways, let me just read a couple other things here. With regard to even the, sharing from the apocalypse of Moses, it also says the same thing, that as far as it says, and on this account, from thy own words I will judge thee by reason of the enmity which the enemy has planted in thee. And so there are many other texts which also allude to this same thing, as far as, the Cain being a child of the wicked one, and that, he was, um, the firstborn son of the devil, and that he was the progenitor of the tares, as it says clearly in the other scriptures. Just because you deny that and can't see it, when people look at and listen to and examine the things that I point out, in my opinion, it becomes very clear. But, again, you can have your opinion and I can have mine, and we can still love each other as brothers at the end of the day, because this is not salvational issue. But I do believe that it is important in understanding even why it was that, all of the patriarchs kept such detailed genealogical records and lists as to who begot who and who was son of whom. And again, you say that, it doesn't matter that Cain is excluded from the genealogy of Christ, but in my opinion, that's a very important distinction, because if Cain was the firstborn of Adam, he should be listed there as the firstborn. But in Luke chapter 3, as well as the Cave of the Treasures and the Book of the Bee, it skips over Cain. It goes from Adam to Seth and
Right.
then onwards.
It skips over Abel too. Like I said in my other point, it doesn't mention any of his. There's lots of children it doesn't mention.
Yeah, but they're only mentioning the firstborn. And
But Seth is not the firstborn.
he is the firstborn.
He's not. Abel, if according to your theory, Abel would be the firstborn of Adam.
Yeah, but he didn't have any children. He didn't beget any children.
But that's not the point.
Any progeny.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. There's a lot of other children that aren't mentioned for a variety of reasons.
The one that is the progenitor of Adam's line, is he not?
Everyone, I mean, according to the genealogy that's followed for a specific reason in Genesis 5 leading up to Genesis 6, but everyone that's a son of Adam through Eve would be a progenitor of his line.
Yeah, but as far as the first one to bear children, that one is said to be Seth. Again, Cain is excluded from Adam's line and is found in Genesis chapter 4. And when you look at the Targum, it explains that, because Cain was not genealogized, neither his seed with the children of Adam. Which, again, please go listen to the first show.
No, I was there. I was there, brother.
I'm talking about the people that are listening in.
Yeah.
A lot of what you're bringing forth, and, I covered all of that in great detail in the first show, and I think quite convincingly, in my opinion.
Now, you covered it with great detail. Again, though, it all boils down to, did the serpent impregnate a woman? And that's what I was trying to show with the variety of texts that I'm on claim 5 now. Did you want to address claim 5? Because that is the crux of the argument that I tried to show that I couldn't find validating support. And for a variety of reasons, for biggest one being that the punishment that the serpent receives does not fit the crime. If Azazel is, literally the father of the devil, because basically we have a semantic issue with the theory. So your theory is that Satan overshadowed or entered into a serpent to impregnate a human woman, and that genealogical seed of Cain was married into Noah's Ark, essentially, if I could, for the sake of time, just briefly put it like that. That way it extends down into history to the point of John chapter 8, where Jesus is saying that you're of your son, the devil. And so therefore you have an issue, because is it a son of literally the Satan, the angel, or is it a son of a serpent? Because you're saying that Satan, the angel, didn't have genitals, He just physically, spiritually, in a mystical way, entered into this serpent and then used the serpent's genitals to impregnate Eve. Yet the mantra, the moniker, the names of this theory that's perpetrated from the terminology in the New Testament, which I claim is being taken out of context, is claiming that they're the son of the devil, like Cain was the son of the wicked one. Well, was he the son of the Satan, the angel, or the son of the actual serpent?
He both, because
Okay, well, the serpent had DNA, but the angel didn't, because you said it didn't have any. His DNA didn't go into Eve. It would have been the serpent's DNA that went to Eve.
well, it depends on what story you read. Some say that Satan indwelt the serpent in order to sneak into the garden. Others say differently, like from the Apocalypse of Peter. Do I know without a doubt as to which it was? No. All I know is that it is in Scripture associated that Cain is the firstborn, the progenitor of the tares, and that they are the children of the devil. Christ says that, and undeniably, he says that the tares
Right.
are
But
the children of the devil, and the enemy snuck into the garden and sowed the tares. And so, whether that enemy was,
so let's take that verbiage of Matthew 13 and John 8, and let's run with it, okay? Because let's take it to its full extension. If we claim that being a son of the devil literally means that you're of a genetic bloodline descendancy of, Azazel spiritually taking over the serpent and impregnating Eve, whenever we're called sons of God, how does that work?
well, it says that Adam was a son of God in Luke chapter 3 in the genealogy. Again, it says that,
Okay, but
Adam,
wait a minute now. Your theory though has the seed line of Cain that you claim is a serpent seed going through the ark through one of the wives of Noah's children.
yeah, that's true.
So
Yeah.
then, therefore, you have. So then, basically, goes back to the question I was asking you earlier, in the first part, about the idea of if this theory was truly a real thing, and there is a descendancy through the ark through Noah's children, which would have been one of Ham, Shem, or Japheth's kids, that is propagated into the world throughout today, and that person is next to me in the grocery store, and they're of the serpent seed, and I'm supposedly of the genetic line of, say, Shem. I guess he wasn't one of them. He's considered righteous.
Right.
And so therefore I'm of the genetic line of Shem, and I believe in faith in Yeshua, my Messiah, and believe that God is real, and therefore I'm of the Son of God. So you're saying what I'm getting at is the terminology of 1 John that says those people who do the will of God, like Jesus talks about, my brothers and sisters are those who do the will of God. We're sons of the light, sons of the day. 1 Thessalonians 5, Ephesians 4, 1 John 3, we're sons of God because we do the commandments of God. It's attributed to behavior, not to DNA.
Well, no, it's attributed to both, because there is a literal physical progeny of the devil.
So then
And-
when I asked you last time, if someone who was the physical, literal progeny of the devil started doing the behavior of God, could they be saved?
Yes, and I did say yes.
You did say yes. Okay. I just want there's people asking in the crowd that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Because Christ died upon the cross in order to extend salvation to both bloodlines.
But
And
the problem we run into, my brother, is that the terminology is so subjective. If you're going to take this New Testament terminology of someone that's a quote unquote son of the devil and someone that's a son of God because they're considered a believer, and you're saying, well, the moment that they believe and they are in faith, and now they're still a son of the devil, but you're saying what? That they're metaphorically a son of God because they're doing the commandments?
well, yeah, they are grafted in. We see that even the pagans, the Gentiles, who are the children of the serpent, that they were excluded before Christ died on the cross. And they were, Israel was told never to even intermix or marry with them or to take pagan wives. And it was after his dying on the cross that they were grafted in with the olive tree, and then salvation extended to them. And so now it's not a matter of election that determines, as far as whether one's born a child of the serpent or a child of God, but it's one's belief in Christ as Savior Messiah, that even the Jews rejected him as such. And that's why, it was extended to the other people.
So
As far
that brings me to the point that we're looking at on the screen. Why doesn't the punishment fit the crime for Azazel, like the other angels that took wives and had children?
Well, because that was a whole different scenario. The thing with the Watchers, that was 7 generations afterwards.
Same crime though, same crime. And in fact, in the text I have on screen in 1 Enoch 10, it's got Azazel and the Watchers in chapter 8 and then also in chapter 15 being blamed for corrupting the earth, but differentiating some of their other behaviors as far as some of them taking wives.
Yeah, again, the whole thing with Azazel, or if you want to call him Satan or Lucifer, that was at the very beginning. And just it's the same thing with let both grow together until the time of the end. God was not going to punish and cut off the tares or uproot them, because he could have uprooted the wheat together with them. He says, let both grow together until the time of the end, because it's going to be, even the children born of the devil, it's through their lifetime and through their sinning and committing evil that determines that they should be judged and condemned. But
But I'm asking about the judgment specifically of Azazel that's pronounced in 1 Enoch.
well, yeah, I
And
know, and I'm saying that because that was the very first episode, Satan was given
so
a
you're
reprieve.
so you're saying, okay, so you're saying that because it didn't happen in the days of Jared/Enoch leading up to the days of Noah, because it happened earlier, he doesn't get the same punishment as the other angels.
That's right. It was a whole different scenario,
Okay.
a whole different episode.
I would
And
have to disagree with that, but I still have some issue with the verbiage and the terminology of Matthew 13, because if you're saying that someone is a son of Satan because he's literally a genetic seed bloodline son of Satan, and then he wants to do righteous behavior and become a believer, then he's now a son of God grafted in. So what happens then? You also claim that there's those who are literal genetic sons from Adam through Noah as sons of God, and that so then if they started doing behavior of the serpent, which is corruptive wickedness and sin, are they now sons of the devil?
yes, and they are blotted out of the books of life.
So how do you know Jesus isn't calling the Pharisees in John chapter 8 the exact usage of that phrase, not saying they're literal bloodlines, but saying because of their behavior, they're sons of the devil? Because in that passage, he goes on to tell them, you are of your father the devil because you do the deeds of your father. If you were of your father Abraham, you would do the deeds of Abraham. He's not there. The context there doesn't prescribe it to being a genetic issue.
That's not true at all. And again, that's your opinion and that's your interpretation. But when you understand that there literally is a physical bloodline and genealogy connected to the children of the devil, then that makes complete sense. And the fact that he calls them a brood of vipers as well shows that they are connected to the serpent, which he calls Satan, the ancient dragon. And so, there's this whole reptilian aspect, which we covered this in the first show, how Cain was seraphic in appearance.
Now that was from either the Legends of the Jews or from commentary from the 17th century, right?
Well, yeah, Legends of the Jews, but again,
that's not even a book that's not even a book some people consider scripture. That's literally commentary about legends.
Exactly.
Okay.
But again, it shows us that there is something to the whole fact that the children of Cain are, associated with the brood of vipers and considered to be reptilian in nature in some manner.
Or is it just possible the gentleman that wrote that commentary already believed in this theory, and that's why he was writing stuff to support it?
Yeah, he did believe in this theory because this is the truth of what was common knowledge in ancient times. It's only now that we are in modern times and after all these translations that this truth becomes lost. But it's still there encoded into all of the scriptures when you have the eyes to see, the ears to hear, and a mind to understand. Anybody that really opens themselves to this possibility and goes and studies it out in the manner that I have, it becomes very apparent. And I think that, just reading the commentary on the video that we did on the first show, many people agree to what I'm bringing forth as truth.
Well, for sure, your audience definitely agrees, brother. I mean, they've been following you for a while. They already believe this theory. Many of them found you because of this theory. They've come to you because they heard of this theory and they heard you explain it with great detail. So that would draw them to you. But my audience is a little different. But at the same time, it's okay. I mean, that's why we're doing this. We're exchanging ideas. We want to make sure that you had a chance to lay out the full case. So you basically, you rebutted my claim of saying that the punishment didn't fit the crime. Did you want to address the last one?
Yeah, sure. What was the last one?
Let me pull up the screen real quick. And you already addressed that, actually. We during our discourse, we already addressed that. But the last one was that Satan fathered Cain through Eve. And I was just trying to show you just through the text itself. And I think you pretty much covered this in part one from how you were reading the text and introduction of the Targum, the Jerusalem Targum and everything, which is why I started out my first point with explaining the history of the Targum and how it differs in some cases and how it is a translation like the Septuagint, the Masoretic, or other translations. And then I went in just showing the idea of how the manuscripts do not literally say what you're saying they say. At least the major ones that we've all read and are familiar with. And then therefore Jubilees specifically completely dismantles this theory, brother. But you don't like Jubilees, is that correct?
No, I do like Jubilees. I like all of the texts, but when they are contrary to what is found in the canon, clearly revealed in the canon, then what?
Well, you know that Jubilees is in the canon, right?
In the Ethiopic canon, yeah.
Which is an older canon than any other canon.
Yeah, but again, when it comes to what is revealed within the King James, which is what we're talking about, since
why does the King James in the 15th century, why does that get precedence over Levites making a canon in the 2nd century BC?
People, for whatever reason, love the King James, and that's
no, I'm not talking about popular opinion. I just mean literally from a textual basis, as far as what theology we find is valid or not. Like, why would we give precedence to? And for one, I don't agree with you that the King James says it. I actually have it on screen here. It's right here in front of us that the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. But even if it said something different, why would I give precedence to the King James version over something that's 1,000 years older?
I personally don't. I give precedence to the Targum. That's why because it is the oldest and the first translation of the Hebrew Torah into a different language, Aramaic, and it's the one that the Israelites used themselves when worship was reinstituted. That's the one I read from, and that is the one that says, "And Adam knew Hava, his wife, who had desired the angel,
right.
and she conceived and bare Cain. And she said, I've acquired a man, the angel of the Lord," which other translations interpret that text. "And Adam knew his wife, who had conceived by the angel Samael, was pregnant and bare Cain, whose resemblance was like the upper creatures and not like the lower. And she said, I have got the man, the angel of the Lord." Another one says Cain's descent from Satan, who is the angel Samael, was revealed in his seraphic appearance. At birth, the exclamation was wrung from Eve, "I have gotten a man through an angel of the Lord." And so, you say that it doesn't say that, but these ancient interpreters and commentators and people that have written authoritative works on what that translation actually is referencing, they say otherwise. I say otherwise. In the Targum, again, in Genesis 5, it says, "And Adam lived 130 years, begat Sheth, who had the likeness of his image and of his similitude. For before had Hava borne Cain, who was not like to him, and Abel was killed by his hand. And
Sure.
Cain was cast out, neither is his seed genealized in the book of the genealogy of Adam."
And where are you reading from?
That's from the Targum, chapter 5,
Okay.
which is, again, where we see the generations of Adam being perpetuated through Seth.
And we're talking about the Jerusalem Targum.
Yeah.
The Jerusalem Targum. Okay. So that's the one that was from the Onkelos that was mixed together with the other fragments of the Jerusalem Targum to create a complete copy that's been passed through a rabbinical process of admixture and revision.
That's what the professional opinion is. But again,
Well, that's actually why I put these things on screen, because in the very first slides that I put up, I actually showed the differences in the texts that we can validate through historical process before the time of Christ compared to the Jerusalem Targum, and how they are different. And you can see where words have been added in and things have been changed.
no, that's not true. They are different because they are older, and they had this information included before the other translations removed them. That's what actually happened, not what.
So according to actual rabbis who have an institute for Hebrew studies and Jewish religious studies, they claim that the Targum, the Jerusalem Targum, has been handled and revised by a rabbi over the centuries. That's their historical claim, that it's a well-known fact, and that's all I'm saying. That's where I got that information from. That's all. But it's okay if you disagree.
Well, yeah, that's fine. But yeah, it was handled by rabbis because the rabbis were the ones that had used it and even authorized its translation going back to the 4th century. But, again, this version is older than the Greek Septuagint, even though Wikipedia says that it's from the 1st century or 2nd century CE. That's not true at all. It dates back to when the temple was rebuilt and they came back to the Holy Land after the diaspora in 587 BC. And the temple was rebuilt by I think it was 446 BC. And this translation was then authorized. And when it came about, that was what the Israelites used when they studied and went to worship. And so, again, this one is older and than even the Greek Septuagint, and that's why you see in the Greek and even in the King James, which is 2,000 years later, these passages that you find so much more information in the Aramaic Targum, which are excluded from these other translations. And it's because it's older and it still has preserved within it, as I said previously, with, allusion to the word of the Lord, which has been removed 200 plus times out of, what was the English translation of the Pentateuch. 217 times there's allusion to the word of the Lord in the Aramaic Targum, which are not found in the King James or the Greek Septuagint.
I thought though okay. All right. Well, for the sake of time, I'm going to ask one more playful question about this, which really, I don't even consider it a valid rebuttal. It's just a playful question. And then I'd like to take a couple questions from the crowd that's watching. And my question is, brother, if in the book of First Enoch, we have an incredible amount of description and dialogue and explanation about rebellious angels, and specifically under the context of them taking wives and having children. Why isn't it at any point mentioned that Satan, Azazel, already had a child through Eve?
Well, actually, there is mention of this, and you see this in
the book of First Enoch.
Yeah, First Enoch, and I believe it's chapter 9, where Seth goes forth and he convicts Cain's seed, and he talks about how their seed's going to be wiped from the earth, and it shows that there's a distinction between Abel and Cain, and that he is of a different seed line. But again, the whole thing of the context of the book of Enoch is specific to what occurs with the Watchers and their rebellion. It doesn't go.
I don't see that, brother. Would you say chapter 8?
You can have chapter 8 or chapter 9, one of those, somewhere around there, where Seth is accusing Cain's seed, and it talks about how Cain's seed will be wiped from the earth. But again, the whole thing is that this is specific to what happens with the 200 Watchers that rebelled during the time of Yared. And that's what the whole rebellion of the Watchers, and they're taking wives of the daughters of Cain, which again, I implore people to read the Kebra Nagas, chapter 100, because it shows you that these Watchers were given male bodies of flesh. And when they were given male bodies of flesh, that's why they were able to copulate with the daughters of Cain, and they actually had male testicles, penises, which made that, copulation possible.
Isn't the Kebra Nagash from the 14th century?
I don't know when it's from. It's part of the
Yeah.
Ethiopic, whatever.
Yeah, it's actually a later addition to Ethiopic writings. It's not a part of their canon, but it's around the 14th century. But what is a part of their canon is Jubilees, and that literally tells us angels were born circumcised. So
Well,
that's where
you say circumcised, them being born circumcised means that they had penises, but in my opinion, the only creatures that need penises are those that are going to copulate and bear children in order to bring forth,
right.
continue their generations, which are humans. I don't think that angels have penises, but we can agree to disagree.
Well, they okay, that's fine. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience though before we get too far into the night, because we've been going. Man, it's been a little over 2 hours already. So,
Yeah.
guys, put all your questions in caps so that I can see them easily and the moderators can see them easily. Let me see. We've got next YouTube. I think that's what he's next YouTube. He's asking, the only way to have two bloodlines would be Adam and a female serpent. What do you say about that?
No, that's not true, because again, you see that Eve is the mother of all the living, and that there is in Genesis 3:15, God says to the serpent, I'm going to put enmity between your seed and her seed. So there are two seed lines, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. Cain was of the wicked one, as it says in First John chapter 3, verse 12.
So then you would say
13, the enemy stuck into the garden sowed the tares. Cain is the tares.
So then you would say a serpent chromosome made it onto the ark through one of the wives of Noah's sons.
Yes, and that's chapter 19 of my 12th book, The Great Contest 2, Enmity Between the Seed Lines, which you can also find a Facebook note on my Facebook page. It's chapter 19, How the Serpent Seed Survived the Flood of Noah's Day. Because Ham was of Noah's second wife, Nama, who was the sister of Tubal-Cain, and she was serpent seed herself. He slept with her and brought forth Canaan, and Canaan was predominantly serpent seed, and so that's how the serpent seed survived the flood. But you can go to that chapter; it's written out in very great detail.
We have another question from Marcia. She's asking, ask Zen, if God never changes, then how can the punishment of adultery be overlooked for Eve and the serpent?
Well, again, this is because it was the first episode and the first occurrence, and God warned them, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the day that you eat thereof, you shall die. And that's the punishment that was brought upon them. They were placed into mortal embodiment. And then, as we see in Genesis 3:15, there would be enmity between the seed of the woman, the seed of the serpent. Adam would have to work the soil to bring forth sustenance to feed what would be his children. And then they were banished here to the earth. And Eve did fulfill what God said in Genesis 3:16, that she's going to have to bear children in sorrow. And she bore Cain first, who was of the wicked one. He killed his brother Abel, and then she birthed Seth, and that it would be through Seth that the children of Adam would be propagated. And we find that, Genesis chapter 4, 10 generations of Cain separated from the 10 generations of Adam in Genesis chapter 5.
Okay, brother. I have a few more questions here. And folks, if I'm skipping over some of your questions because we have addressed your questions tonight during this broadcast at length. So don't think I'm ignoring you intentionally, but please go back. You may have showed up late to the broadcast. Please go back and watch the broadcast earlier so that we address some of those questions at length. Carla Marburg is asking, was Adam not human until he grew genitals?
Right, exactly. Adam was not a human. He was bright natured. And then when he ate, after he ate, Eve ate first, and then he ate with her. That's when they were in mortal embodiment. And that's when their genitals appear. And that's why after they commit this act, they sew the fig leaves in order to cover their genitals. And then, being horrified and embarrassed at what they had done, they hide themselves from God.
Okay. Okay. Looks like we have a question from Maxim Lavrov. He's asking if there were other people planted outside of the garden, how is Eve the mother of all living?
Again, she's the mother of all living because she bore the child of the serpent, Cain, and also the child of Adam, Abel. But because Abel was murdered by Cain, then she had to bear um, Seth, whose name means compensation, substitution, and replacement. And it would be through Seth that we see the genealogy of Adam continues. And that's why, because Christ was the pure seed of the woman. And you see in Luke chapter 3 that Cain is excluded from his genealogy, and it's because he was not the child of Adam.
Okay. So we have another quick question here saying, Zen, could Cain be the Antichrist or the son of perdition?
I believe that the Antichrist will be, part of his particular bloodline, but Cain was the firstborn of the wicked one, and he has died and passed on. And so, no, I don't believe he's going to be the Antichrist.
Okay. Looks like Stephanie Myers is asking, if Cain were Satan's seed, why would God expect him to give the sacrifice? Are the seed of Satan able to receive salvation?
Yes, they were able, and that's why God, when he went to Cain, he says, if you just do well, then you will be accepted. Because God was willing to accept Cain, even though he was a child of the devil, but he murdered his brother. And who is said to be a murderer? The devil is said to be a murderer, a liar, and a deceiver, just as Cain was. And if Cain was of Adam, why would he be also a murderer, a liar, and a deceiver? It is because Adam was not his father. He takes and has inclination after the serpent, and it's because the serpent was his father. And
We have
so,
a,
but yes, God and even Christ uh, allows for the serpent seed to be saved if they believe on him and if they accept him as Christ and Savior Messiah.
okay, thank you, brother. Hanging on his words is asking a question. I think we covered this in part one. So now I think I know what you already answered me. He said, how could Adam and Eve be fruitful and multiply if they didn't have the parts to carry out that command from the beginning? And if I'm not mistaken, I asked you this question or something very similar
Right.
in part one, and you said that's the hominid theory of Genesis 1, 26 to 28.
Those are the pre-Adamites. These hominids were created on the earth, and they were created to multiply, to bear fruit, to be fruitful, and to replenish the earth. But Adam in Genesis 2:4 was created and placed in paradise, and he had a bright nature, completely separate creation.
Okay, so that's the theory that, and I like I joked last time, that's probably a whole separate conversation, really. But that's a supplemental theory that lends into this, basically.
Really.
Yeah. It looks like Lynn Curran is asking, Zen, wasn't Cain marked with a horn from Yahweh?
That is correct according to the book of Jasher. They said that the mark was that he had a horn. And so when Lamech, and just as Satan was given a reprieve of 7,000 years, what is the duration of the second world age, so was Cain given a reprieve of 7 generations. And he would be killed by Lamech, who was the father of Nama and Tubal Cain. And he had taken his grandson hunting with him, and because he was blind, when he pointed him in a direction, he would shoot. And when he shot what he thought was a beast and went out there and felt the horn, he realized that this was Cain, and so he clapped his hands in I guess, concern. And in that manner, it says in the text in Jasher that he killed Tubal Cain. And because he was blind, he had to sit out there and wait. And then his wives came and found him. And that's when it says that, you know, um, if Cain was cursed 7 generations, that he would be cursed 70 and 7, because not only did he kill Cain, he had killed his grandson as well.
Okay, thank you, brother. Looks like there's a question for me coming in. Kingdom of Context, how do you explain John 8:44, where Jesus says you belong to your father, the devil? And that's where I'm not sure if you just showed up, but we were talking about this about 45 minutes ago, where I was going back and forth running through the full idea of that language, on both sides, whether you're considered a son of the devil or a son of God, and whether it's literal or figurative, and how we could determine that difference in the language. Personally, if my understanding from the context of the verses surrounding the statement in John 8, Jesus directly juxtaposes this statement with explaining that you're of your father the devil because you do the deeds of him, but if you were of your father Abraham, you would do his deeds. And so therefore he's not speaking literally, speaking figuratively from my understanding. So
Can I add one thing with regard to this? Because we see that also in Matthew and Luke, that Christ alludes to the Pharisees as the murderers of the prophets. And then he says of them that your fathers have always been the assassins of the prophets. And he says that because they had killed from Abel to Zacharias. And so we know that Cain killed Abel. And so he's linking them to the line of Cain without a doubt. And so, I mean, you can't deny that. And Zacharias was the father of John the Baptist, who was killed in the Holy of Holies. And so, Abel to Zacharias, Cain killing Abel, I mean, you can't get around it. He's linking them to the lineage of Cain, which explains that passage, that you are of your father the devil.
I mean, respectfully, I would say the context directly tells us it's figurative, but I understand where you're coming from. I do think it's interesting that he mentions Abel all the way up to Zacharias, because it is interesting. Because we see that also in 1 Enoch 22, as well as in Hebrews 11, talking about the blood of Abel crying out, and because it's righteous. And so the Pharisees were definitely unrighteous, and they had a long-standing history of this. We do cover this on my channel. So in that regard, Zen, I don't know how much of my channel you've seen, but we actually talk about how the Pharisees, they were absconding the priesthood. They were infiltrating up and getting to a point where by the time they're at the days of Christ, it's a corrupted priesthood, which is why they reject him and kill him. And this was even prophesied in the Testament of Levi and Testament 12 Patriarchs. And so I think it's interesting that there is this specific group of people that are the constant antagonists, but from the research and from all the evidence you present and everything, I just don't think they're literal serpent seed. I think we have a couple more questions if you can handle them, and otherwise we can.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. So it looks like Hanging on His Words is asking, wasn't Eve fashioned from the flesh of Adam? How can this be if they didn't have flesh until the fall?
Well, Eve was taken out of the rib of Adam, but when she was created, she was also bright nature. And as we covered this, they were flesh and bone, but not yet they have the blood within them. And the blood is what begins the aging process and what begins their being under the authority of death. And that didn't happen until they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God said, in the day that you eat or touch thereof, ye shall die. And when they did eat from this fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that's when they came and were transformed into mortal embodiment. That's when their genitals appear, and that's when the serpent beguiled Eve, impregnated her with Cain. And so that's when they came under complete flesh embodiment. But as we covered, they were bright natured before they took on what is flesh embodiment completely.
Okay. Last question. Jesus called Simon Peter Satan one time. Literal or figurative?
Well, whether Satan actually indwelt him, we don't really know. But there's a reason why he said as much. This same thing is also alluded to with Judas and Pharaoh and the king of Tyrus and Babylon. And so it's my opinion that Satan is able to possess and to take over, just like Legion does with those particular people that were possessed and that had these devils cast out of them. So we don't know, but Christ does, say that for a particular reason.
Yeah, that actually jumps into a really unique conversation, and we did address this in Honor King season 1. I think it was episode 18, where we're digging into the text about, can Satan as a physical angel possess a physical human? Now we know that unclean spirits can. That obviously is one of the reasons they were created, as Jubilees 10 explains, and also in 1 Enoch 15, they lost their bodies, they're disembodied, therefore they're causing problems with mankind. And we see all throughout the Gospels, they can possess somebody, which causes the body to react in horrible negative ways, causes the mind to break, causes all kinds of problems, as we see with the demoniac in Mark 5 and Matthew 8. But can Satan, a physical angel, possess someone? And if they can, does that mean that the good and righteous angels physically, not whether they would choose to or not, but physically, like Michael and Raphael, Uriel, could they actually come down and possess somebody? Is that cool? Is that ability to be possible? Because they have a physical body. It's just not made of dirt. It's made of water. So this is where it's a fun theological conversation, probably for another time. But Zen, I just want to, my hats off to you for coming on here, brother, and letting me offer these rebuttals to you and letting us have this conversation in public so everyone can see that, you know what, we're brothers in the Lord. We may not agree on every single point. We agree on the basics. We agree on the more than the basics, honestly. We agree on 95% of things, but on this particular theory, we disagree. And I think it's important, so important, especially in this day and age, when there's so much strife and division in the body, for people to be able to see two brothers disagreeing, but still having a loving conversation where they can, you know what I'm saying, we can spar back and forth, but at the end of the day, we're brothers in the Lord. We want to share Christ with as many people as we can. I know that's your heart. I've seen it. That's our heart here at Kingdom of Context. And thanks for coming on, brother. It was a great honor to have you.
It's my great pleasure, brother. And if you should want to do, part 3 from other manuscripts, we can do so, or we can leave it like this. But yeah, I appreciate you as well. And, most people do not agree with a lot of the things that I say. And so I welcome debate, because it's only in sharing discourse that we can learn from one another, and that those that listen and that are seeking truth themselves can also learn from such conversations. So I applaud you in your efforts, brother, and honor you as a family in Christ as well.
Thank you, brother. And just one last question here, and I think I saw this one asked earlier, and even last time we did this, and I didn't answer it. So someone's asking me, how do I interpret? They know how you interpret this passage. They're asking me, how do I interpret the enmity between her and Satan's seed verse? And I interpret it as I've shared on my channel many times in our Kingdom portions, that it's not a literal seed. It is about your behavior, and that's what you become the seed of. I mentioned this in the part 1 a little bit, but didn't go into a full-on rebuttal, because again, it's not the crux of the serpent seed argument as far as did the physical act occur. It's some of the surrounding, peripheral attachment arguments that can go to it. But if you look in the Genesis, where it talks about Abraham and how his seed will bring forth nations, but we know that people are called of the seed of Abraham, like Jesus says in John 8 and in Galatians 4 from Paul, if you're doing the behavior of the covenant. And this is what we actually see in the Jerusalem and Onkelos Targum, in the parentheses and in the added words, if you will, the extra verbiage that's in there in those passages, where it talks about those who will do the commandments will crush the head of the serpent. And that's an allusion to their behavior. That's what them doing their behavior will put them in enmity with the enemy, which is an obvious thing that we all notice in life, right? It's why Yeshua was killed. It's why the prophets are persecuted and killed, the apostles as well. In our average everyday life, in our world and our government, why the occulted secret organizations that run many governments are systematically persecuting believers in Christ and in the way constantly, because there is constant enmity between the two behaviors. One is of destruction and death, and the other one is life and peace. And this is what Enoch, I think it's in chapter 91 or 92, it actually talks about this, where the righteous will say, where can we go to get away from these people that are constantly persecuting us? And the Father's just encouraging him that there will come a time where he and his son, Enoch 105, will come down and be united with mankind. He's going to bring his house down, the New Jerusalem. The kingdom of God will be realized on the earth, and the wicked will be snuffed out. Peace will reign. Only the good behavior, only those who do the will of the Father, the commandments of God, will be left. And that's the glory that we wait for. It's our, our redemption draws nigh, folks. So be encouraged. And thank you guys for joining us in this awesome discussion. And
Can I answer that person real quick? Just really quick.
well, haven't you have, right? Like, I mean, that's the crux to your argument.
Yeah, well, but I just wanted to add that I do believe that Genesis 3:15 is the crux of the argument, and that, Satan does have seed, literal physical progeny, and that even the word for seed there means descendants, progeny, children. And so, in my opinion, that passage without a doubt shows that Satan has literal children here on the earth.
Okay, thank you, brother. All right, guys, thanks for joining us, everyone, tonight. We've gone a long time. We're almost at 3 hours, and
Wow.
we hope. Yeah, no, it just flies by, brother. It flies by. Thank you, guys, and we'll hope to see you next week here on Milk and Meat.
God bless.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this video and this broadcast. We appreciate all of you, and thank you for your patronage. Please do like and subscribe and share with your friends. God bless all of you in your seeking.